Time does not heal the wounds of the missing. It only buries the truth beneath decades of silence, leaving families to wait for a closure that arrives long after hope has died. While platform guidelines restrict us from showing the raw, unedited reality of these crime scenes, the clinical, documented facts of these 10 stolen identities remain devastating enough to speak for themselves. If you enjoy investigations, you can subscribe to the channel, and I will try to release interesting investigations as often as possible. In the chilling late winter environment of February 1957, the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, presented a stark contrast between post-war suburban development and desolate, overgrown rural fringes. Susquehanna Road, a secluded and dumping-prone thoroughfare flanked by dense woods and illegal trash sites, became the focal point of one of the most enduring forensic mysteries in American history. Amidst the discarded debris of everyday life, a fragile cardboard box, originally manufactured to transport a JCPenney bassinet, harbored the tragic remains of an unidentified male child, subsequently estimated by medical examiners to be between 3 and 7 years of age. The physical condition of the boy indicated a brief life characterized by profound neglect and severe malnutrition. With his tiny frame weighing a mere 30 pounds and bearing the undeniable marks of systemic, repeated physical abuse, his hair had been hastily and clumsily shorn close to his scalp, leaving tufts of cut hair clinging to his body, suggesting the crude haircut was administered either shortly before or immediately following his demise. Investigators meticulously documented numerous small, faded scars across his pale body, particularly noting concentrated markings on his ankle, groin, and chin alongside a distinct, surgically repaired hernia that pointed to previous, documented medical intervention. The child's body was discovered entirely nude, save for being tightly wrapped in a cheap, distinctly patterned Indian-style flannel blanket that had been severed in half, offering investigators one of the few tangible physical clues present at the primary scene. Despite the severe weather conditions of the Pennsylvania winter and the body's exposure to the elements, the post-mortem lividity and the specific state of rigor mortis indicated that he had not been residing in the desolate woodland area for an extended period before his discovery. The sheer brutality of the boy's condition stood in sharp, unsettling defiance of the era's idealized perception of the American nuclear family, forcing a community to confront the horrifying reality of a child discarded like common industrial refuse. This initial physical assessment provided law enforcement with a hauntingly detailed, yet completely nameless, victim, establishing a grim baseline for a homicide investigation that would span more than 6 decades and consume successive generations of dedicated detectives. The chronological trajectory of the investigation was fundamentally compromised from its very inception due to a fatal, fear-driven delay in reporting the initial discovery of the remains by a civilian witness. A young LaSalle College student named Frederick Benonis had been navigating the dense underbrush along the fringes of Susquehanna Road to check on his strategically placed rabbit traps when he inadvertently stumbled upon the discarded bassinet box. Benonis, acutely aware of recent police activity in the immediate vicinity regarding reports of a voyeur operating in the local area, harbored deep anxieties that his unexplainable presence in the isolated woods would result in his wrongful implication in those unrelated, illicit offenses. Consequently, he made the fateful, silent decision to conceal his grim discovery, returning to his daily routine and leaving the child's remains exposed to the harsh elements and potential animal predation for an additional, critical period of time. It was not until the following day, after hearing a local radio broadcast explicitly detailing the active search for a missing 4-year-old girl from neighboring New Jersey, that Benonis felt a moral compulsion to contact the authorities, erroneously believing the small body he observed might belong to her. When Philadelphia police detectives finally arrived at the heavily compromised, weather-beaten scene on February 26, 1957, they rapidly ascertained that the victim was a tragically battered male child, initiating an immediate and expansive procedural response across the entire jurisdiction. Forensics units descended upon the illegal dumping ground, meticulously cataloging the surrounding flora, examining degraded tire tracks preserved in the frozen mud, and securing the torn plaid blanket and the JCPenney box in a desperate search for trace, microscopic evidence. The definitive inciting incident that escalated the case from a localized, tragic homicide to a sprawling, unprecedented forensic anomaly was the shocking, immediate revelation that no local, regional, or state-wide missing persons reports matched the precise physical description of the deceased boy. Detectives systematically scoured regional hospital birth records, pediatric surgical files focusing specifically on hernia repairs, and local orphanage registries, yet the child appeared to exist entirely outside the documented, bureaucratic systems of modern society. This absolute void of prior documentation transformed the grim crime scene into a profound procedural nightmare, forcing investigators to confront the chilling realization that whoever had systematically abused and murdered the child had also successfully erased his entire social existence prior to his unceremonious disposal. The subsequent investigation triggered one of the most exhaustive and heavily publicized manhunts in the history of the Philadelphia Police Department, characterized by massive public outreach initiatives and decades of frustratingly inconclusive, dead-end leads. Law enforcement agencies distributed over 400,000 flyers bearing the retouched, post-mortem photograph of the boy's face, meticulously staging his features to appear as they might have in life, and inserted these stark notices into every single gas bill mailed within the city of Philadelphia. The sheer volume of forensic evidence initially gathered at the scene, including the specific manufacturing origins of the bassinet box, which was traced directly back to an Upper Darby JCPenney store, and a distinctive blue corduroy cap discovered near the body, ultimately yielded no actionable suspects or viable theories. Medical examiner investigator Remington Bristow dedicated the entirety of his professional career and a significant portion of his personal finances to the case, heavily promoting the theory that the boy belonged to a local foster home, located mere miles from the scene, though rigorous polygraph tests and extensive interviews ultimately failed to secure any legal indictments. The procedural narrative shifted dramatically decades later. In the year 2002, when a woman identified in investigative files only by the pseudonym M came forward to authorities with a harrowing, detailed account claiming her violently abusive mother had purchased the boy from his biological parents in 1954. M provided authorities with chillingly specific details that had never been released to the general public, including the grim assertion that the boy had been forcefully bathed prior to his death and that his stomach contained the undigested remnants of baked beans, aligning perfectly with the coroner's classified, original autopsy report. Despite the highly compelling nature of her testimony and the impossible to guess corroboration of these secret forensic details, M's documented lifelong history of severe mental illness and the complete lack of secondary corroborating witnesses forced investigators to cautiously classify her account as highly plausible, but fundamentally unprovable in a court of law. Recognizing the severe technical limitations of mid-20th century investigative techniques, authorities officially obtained judicial approval to exhume the child's remains from his anonymous Potter's Field grave in 1998, specifically aiming to extract viable mitochondrial DNA from his dental enamel for future comparative analysis. Unfortunately, the severely degraded state of the biological material yielded a highly fragmented, incomplete profile that proved entirely insufficient for definitive matching through the nascent, early iteration genomic databases of the era, pushing the investigation back into a state of agonizing dormancy. It required a second, highly sophisticated exhumation in 2019, utilizing highly advanced forensic extraction methods designed specifically for compromised bone material, to secure a comprehensive autosomal DNA sample, finally generating the raw genetic data necessary to penetrate the impenetrable wall of anonymity surrounding the child. The absolute peak of investigative tension and the ultimate, long-awaited resolution of the boy's identity materialized through the groundbreaking application of modern forensic genetic genealogy, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the 65-year-old cold case. In 2022, prominent genetic genealogists, operating in strict conjunction with the Philadelphia Police Department and the specialized experts at the Vidocq Society successfully uploaded the boy's newly refined autosomal DNA profile into comprehensive commercial genomic databases, specifically targeting platforms like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. This highly complex analytical process involved the meticulous mapping of distant genetic relatives, requiring investigators to laboriously construct massive, intersecting family trees dating back multiple generations to mathematically isolate the boy's specific historical lineage. The forensic genealogists identified two distinct, sprawling family branches, one firmly rooted in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, representing the paternal line, and another corresponding to the maternal lineage, both of which contained numerous siblings, complex marital histories, and decades of undocumented family dynamics. The critical breakthrough occurred when investigators successfully triangulated a specific, undeniable intersection between these two distinct family trees, pinpointing a previously undocumented, clandestine union that mathematically and genetically had to have produced the specific victim in question. Law enforcement officials subsequently initiated highly discreet, sensitive interviews with the surviving, often elderly relatives identified through the exhaustive genetic mapping, carefully navigating the sensitive familial dynamics to acquire voluntary, confirmatory DNA samples for direct comparison. These secondary modern samples were subjected to rigorous comparative analysis against the boy's extracted historical profile, yielding an undeniable, statistically absolute match that irrevocably shattered the dense anonymity that had defined the case since the winter of 1957. The meticulous nature of this genetic reconstruction definitively revealed that the child was born into a prominent local family, but his birth had never been officially registered in a standard manner that would have triggered governmental oversight or generated a traceable birth certificate. The painstaking identification process not only provided a definitive, legal name to the nameless victim, but also definitively excluded several long-standing suspects and theoretical narratives, replacing decades of rampant, often sensationalized public speculation with cold, irrefutable biological fact. This profound scientific achievement represented the direct culmination of thousands of hours of unseen, painstaking laboratory work, proving unequivocally that the silent biological evidence preserved within the child's remains harbored the ultimate, undeniable truth of his tragic origins. On December 8, 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department convened a solemn, highly anticipated press conference to officially announce the formal identification of the boy in the box as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, confirming his precise date of birth as January 13, 1953. The investigative authorities publicly disclosed that both of Joseph's biological parents had been deceased for many years, but they unequivocally confirmed the existence of several living siblings who had remained entirely unaware of the child's tragic existence, extensive suffering, and subsequent brutal demise. While the permanent restoration of his given name represented a monumental, historic victory for the application of forensic science, law enforcement officials explicitly reiterated that the underlying criminal investigation into his brutal, unsolved homicide remains fully active and open. Detectives are currently focusing their specialized efforts on tracing the precise sequence of events, living arrangements, and custodial transfers that occurred between Joseph's undocumented birth and the brutal, localized blunt force trauma that ultimately ended his brief, agonizing life. The formal identification has prompted investigators to aggressively solicit new, hyper-specific public information regarding the Zarelli family dynamics during the mid-1950s, hoping that a localized, targeted appeal might dislodge long-suppressed memories from aging neighbors, former associates, or distant relatives. The newly engraved headstone bearing his true, legal name stands as a permanent testament to the relentless, generational pursuit of objective truth, ensuring that the historical record accurately reflects the stark reality of a stolen life rather than perpetuating a sensationalized, fictionalized urban legend. However, the deeply sobering reality remains that the specific, violent individual who physically struck the fatal blow and subsequently concealed Joseph's battered body inside the cardboard bassinet box has yet to be legally held accountable for their horrific actions. As investigators continue to meticulously assemble the remaining, fragmented pieces of Joseph's erased history, The forensic focus of our examination naturally pivots from those whose identities were violently stolen in childhood to those who deliberately sought to erase their own existence in adulthood. This psychological transition from a helpless victim subjected to absolute, forced anonymity to an individual actively orchestrating their own disappearance brings us directly to the profound, quiet isolation of a remote Washington motel. In a nondescript room paid for exclusively with cash and registered under an explicitly fabricated alias derived from modern literature, another nameless body waited for a heavily delayed reunion with the reality he had meticulously, yet unsuccessfully, tried to escape. The remote, rain-swept landscape of the Olympic Peninsula has long served as a natural barrier between the structured reality of modern society and the untamed, isolating wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. In September 2001, just days after the world's attention was irrevocably fractured by global tragedy, a young, unremarkable man stepped off a local transit bus and walked into the small, heavily forested community of Amanda Park, Washington. He approached the front desk of the Quinault Inn, a modest roadside establishment catering primarily to passing loggers and transient laborers, projecting an aura of quiet, polite detachment. Presenting himself as a traveler seeking temporary lodging, the man paid for his room using crisp, unmarked cash, deliberately avoiding any financial transaction that would require the physical swiping of a credit card or the verification of official identification. He inscribed the name, Lyle Stevik, into the motel's guest registry, providing a written address corresponding to an existing Best Western hotel in Meridian, Idaho, alongside a carefully fabricated telephone number. The desk clerk noted absolutely nothing overtly alarming about his demeanor. He appeared to be merely another solitary traveler navigating the damp, isolating environment, seeking refuge from the encroaching autumn chill. Once secured inside room 2, the man engaged in a period of profound, calculated isolation, routinely declining daily housekeeping services and venturing out only briefly to pace along the desolate shoulder of the nearby highway. He interacted with virtually no one in the small town, leaving behind no conversational footprint, no casual observations, and no memorable anecdotes for local residents to recall in the ensuing years. The physical belongings he brought with him were strikingly sparse, consisting solely of the clothes he wore on his back, a toothbrush, a tube of toothpaste, and a few miscellaneous toiletries, noticeably lacking the standard luggage or personal effects typical of even a short-term visitor. This deliberate minimalism suggested a chilling premeditation, pointing not toward a temporary vacation or business trip, but rather a final, heavily orchestrated withdrawal from the mechanics and obligations of the living world. He was actively constructing a void, meticulously stripping away any tangible connection to a past life before executing a deeply personal and tragic conclusion to his own narrative. The grim reality of his quiet isolation shattered on the morning of September 17, 2001, when motel staff, having noted the expiration of his paid residency and receiving no response to their knocks, utilized a master key to enter room 2. They were instantly met with a deeply disturbing and meticulously staged scene. The young man had ended his own life through asphyxiation, utilizing a standard leather belt firmly secured to the metal hanging bar located inside the small clothing alcove. The local Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office responded immediately to the rural motel, initiating standard procedural protocols for an unattended death, initially presuming that the deceased would be quickly identified and his next of kin notified within a matter of hours. However, as specialized crime scene investigators processed the sterile, undisturbed environment, the sheer lack of identifying documentation rapidly transformed a tragic suicide into an enduring, incredibly complex forensic enigma. There was no driver's license, no discarded wallet, no accumulated mail, and absolutely no personal correspondence left behind to offer a single, viable clue as to his true identity or the geographical origins of his final journey. On the bedside table, resting with a chilling, clinical politeness, lay a small pile of currency totaling exactly $160, accompanied by a brief, handwritten note that stated simply and without emotion, "For the room." When detectives inevitably attempted to verify the basic information provided in the motel registry, they discovered that the name, Lyle Stevik, was entirely absent from state and federal databases, while the Idaho address belonged to a commercial hotel, where no one by that name had ever been registered as a guest. A highly observant local librarian soon alerted authorities to a highly specific literary connection, pointing out that Lyle Stevik was the exact name of a deeply troubled character in Joyce Carol Oates' 1987 novel. You must remember this, a character who notably attempts suicide within the fictional narrative. This obscure literary pseudonym indicated a highly intelligent, deliberate attempt at obfuscation, proving that the man had consciously adopted an identity intricately linked to his intended final act. The profound realization that this individual had effectively erased his own existence prior to his physical death plunged law enforcement into a labyrinthine investigation, forcing them to search for a phantom who had intentionally severed all ties to the physical world. The inciting incident was not merely the discovery of a deceased individual in a roadside motel, but rather the stark, undeniable confrontation with a meticulously crafted void where a legally documented human identity should have resided. In the agonizing months and years that followed, the Grays Harbor County investigators deployed every conventional forensic tool available within the early 2000s, submitting the deceased's meticulously rolled fingerprints to the FBI's expansive national databases with the confident expectation of a swift, routine match. When the rigorous fingerprint analysis returned unequivocally negative, authorities systematically extracted detailed post-mortem dental records and ultimately developed a full, localized DNA, uploading the genetic markers into the combined DNA index systems CODIS in hopes of flagging a prior criminal offense or a corresponding familial missing persons report. Despite these rigorous, scientifically sound efforts, the digital and biological systems designed to track modern citizens yielded absolute silence, cementing the man's tragic status as a John Doe and propelling the case into a state of protracted, deeply frustrating dormancy. As traditional law enforcement leads inevitably evaporated, the stark, post-mortem photographs of the man, featuring his distinctively prominent chin, detached earlobes, and hazel eyes, found their way onto emerging online platforms dedicated entirely to unsolved mysteries and unidentified remains. The profound mystery surrounding his self-imposed erasure captivated a sprawling, deeply committed global community of amateur web sleuths, who formed dedicated forums and message boards meticulously dissecting every known fragment of his final, isolated days in Washington. For nearly 2 decades, these decentralized groups obsessively cross-referenced a specific physical description against thousands of active missing persons reports from across North America, constantly proposing potential matches that inevitably crumbled under the weight of subsequent dental or genetic comparisons. The investigation was perpetually haunted by devastating false hopes, ranging from transient agricultural workers in neighboring states to runaway youths from the distant East Coast. Yet none of these leads managed to penetrate the impenetrable wall of anonymity he had successfully constructed. Theories regarding his geographical origins grew increasingly complex over time, with online researchers endlessly analyzing the specific manufacturing brands of his clothing, the linguistic style of his brief suicide note, and the potential psychological implications of his chosen literary alias. The sheer volume of speculative energy directed toward the Lyle Stevik persona created a bizarre, unprecedented cultural phenomenon wherein a man who had desperately sought total obscurity in life achieved a perverse, monumental level of fame and death. Investigators remained heavily reliant on the extraordinarily slim possibility that a distant relative might eventually submit a reference sample to a law enforcement database, a passive strategy that forced the official inquiry to stagnate while the internet continued its relentless, often chaotic, pursuit of his true name. This prolonged period of rising action highlighted the agonizing, systemic limitations of relying on traditional criminal databases for individuals who have fundamentally opted out of society, without leaving a traceable, administrative wake. The impenetrable deadlock that had strictly defined the investigation for 17 grueling years was finally shattered in the early spring of 2018, precipitated directly by the revolutionary, rapidly evolving science of investigative genetic genealogy. The Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office officially partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a specialized, highly regarded nonprofit organization dedicated strictly to identifying unknown remains through the complex mapping of expansive, commercial genomic databases. Because the original biological samples had been carefully preserved by the coroner's office, scientists were able to successfully extract a highly complex, dense autosomal DNA profile, representing a massive technological upgrade from the rudimentary CODIS markers that had previously failed to yield any tangible results. This newly refined, comprehensive genetic data was cautiously and legally uploaded into open-source genealogy platforms like GeneMatch, allowing highly trained forensic researchers to cast a vast digital net across millions of voluntary DNA submissions from the general public. Almost immediately, the intensive genealogical analysis identified a complex web of distant genetic cousins geographically clustered in specific regions of New Mexico and Idaho, providing the first tangible geographic anchors in a case that had previously been entirely untethered from any verifiable location. Operating with surgical precision, the investigative genealogists embarked on the grueling, mathematically intensive process of reverse engineering these familial connections, meticulously constructing sprawling family trees that spanned several generations and incorporated hundreds of individual, living relatives. They navigated through dense, undocumented webs of marriages, births, and complex family migrations, mathematically narrowing the genetic possibilities until they successfully isolated a specific, localized family structure that definitively intersected with the John Doe's unique genetic markers. The climactic breakthrough finally arrived when the exhaustive triangulation of this genetic data pointed unequivocally to a single, specific male individual originating from California, born in the mid-1970s, who had abruptly vanished from his family's lives in the late summer of 2001. Law enforcement officers immediately deployed to contact the surviving members of this newly identified family, delicately requesting a direct, one-to-one DNA comparison sample to absolutely verify the highly complex, theoretical genealogical findings. When the final laboratory results were returned from the forensic facility, they provided absolute, irrefutable scientific confirmation. The genetic profile of the young man who died in room 2 matched the family's submitted sample with absolute statistical certainty. The elaborate, carefully constructed facade of Lyle Stevik was instantaneously dissolved by the cold, precise mechanics of modern biological analysis, finally answering the central, agonizing question that had haunted investigators and the public for nearly 2 decades. The formal, legal identification of the deceased provided a profound, devastatingly complicated resolution for a family that had spent exactly 17 years existing in a state of suspended reality, entirely unaware of his deeply tragic fate. During the subsequent, highly sensitive law enforcement interviews, it was revealed that the young man, who was precisely 25 years old at the exact time of his death, had simply drifted away from his relatives, leading them to tragically assume he had consciously chosen to live estranged from them. Because of this devastating assumption regarding his deliberate absence, a formal missing persons report was never officially filed with any jurisdiction, fundamentally explaining why traditional cross-referencing efforts by detectives had completely failed to locate him in any national database. In May 2018, the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office convened a press conference to publicly announce the successful identification, definitively closing the active investigative file on the mysterious death that had captivated the global true crime community for an entire generation. However, out of profound, absolute respect for the extreme privacy of the grieving family, and acknowledging that no external criminal act had occurred aside from the personal tragedy of suicide, authorities made the deliberate, legally sanctioned decision to permanently withhold his legal birth name from the public record. This crucial protective measure ensured that the young man, who so desperately sought total anonymity, in his final hours was granted a measure of posthumous peace, permanently shielding his true identity from the relentless, probing scrutiny of the internet forums that had obsessed over his alias for years. The case remains a highly poignant testament to the quiet, invisible struggles of missing persons, who fall entirely through the massive cracks of societal observation, slipping away without raising the alarms that typically trigger a massive, coordinated police response. His profoundly sad story underscores the chilling, objective reality that sometimes individuals vanish not through malicious external abduction, but through a deeply internal, silent withdrawal that leaves those left behind completely blinded to the devastating truth of their absence. The scientific resolution of this case proves, undeniably, that modern forensic techniques can effectively reconstruct a life even when the individual has meticulously attempted to destroy all records of their own existence. While the young man in Washington utilized deliberate, calculated isolation and an obscure literary alias to successfully mask his identity from the world, other victims of the era were violently, forcibly stripped of their names by the sheer brutality of their killers, abandoned in desolate landscapes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This stark, terrifying contrast between self-imposed erasure and malicious, homicidal concealment directs our forensic focus backward in time to a chilly spring morning in rural Ohio, where another young life was abruptly extinguished and discarded without a trace. Clad only in a distinctively fringed jacket that would forcefully become her sole defining identifier for nearly 40 agonizing years, a young woman lay hidden in a roadside ditch, silently waiting for a future generation of dedicated scientists to finally speak her name. The rural agricultural expanse of Miami County, Ohio, typically defined by its quiet, pastoral rhythms and tight, knit farming communities, became the unexpected focal point of a profound forensic mystery during the early spring of 1981. On the morning of April 24, a local resident casually walking his dog along the secluded, unpaved shoulder of Greenlee Road discovered the meticulously concealed remains of a young female victim resting discarded in a shallow drainage ditch. The young woman, estimated by initial responding medical examiners to be between the ages of 18 and 26, presented a deeply unsettling juxtaposition between her carefully maintained personal appearance and the extreme, calculated violence that had abruptly ended her life. Her physical attire was highly distinct and immediately memorable, contrasting sharply with the standard local fashion of the era, heavily suggesting a transient lifestyle or a recent arrival from a distinctly different geographical region. The most prominent article of clothing she wore was a handcrafted, unlined Native American-style buckskin pullover jacket, adorned with heavy leather fringing along the seams and chest, which would quickly become her defining moniker in the media and police files. Beneath this heavy leather garment, she wore a simple brown turtleneck sweater, Wrangler brand bell-bottom blue jeans, and a pair of sensible, low-heeled shoes, all of which were meticulously cataloged by crime scene technicians searching desperately for manufacturing tags or localized retail indicators. Medical personnel systematically documented the catastrophic injuries that caused her death, determining definitively that she had suffered massive, blunt force trauma to the cranial and facial regions, compounded by the fatal, clinical application of manual strangulation. The sheer brutality of the physical assault indicated a highly personal, violently aggressive encounter, yet the remote location of the disposal site suggested a deliberate, calculated effort by the perpetrator to delay the inevitable discovery of the body. Furthermore, the specific state of rigor mortis, the advanced pooling of post-mortem lividity, and the environmental conditions at the rural scene allowed forensic pathologists to establish a highly precise window of death, estimating that she had been murdered approximately 48 hours prior to her discovery by the roadside. This serene, pastoral setting had been violently transformed into a sterile, heavily documented crime scene, initiating a complex law enforcement protocol that would ultimately span almost 4 decades and push the absolute boundaries of emerging forensic sciences. The immediate investigative trajectory was violently stalled by the stark, undeniable realization that the victim carried absolutely zero identifying documentation, stripping investigators of the most fundamental, baseline information required to initiate a traditional homicide inquiry. Despite the rapid, coordinated deployment of Miami County Sheriff's deputies and the comprehensive processing of the Greenlee Road scene, detectives failed to locate a purse, a discarded wallet, travel tickets, or any personal correspondence that could legally anchor the young woman to a verifiable identity. The inciting incident of this protracted procedural nightmare was not merely the discovery of the body, but the chilling, bureaucratic silence that echoed back when her meticulously rolled fingerprints and comprehensive dental charts were submitted to state and federal databases. In 1981, the highly localized nature of missing persons reports meant that law enforcement agencies operated largely in isolated, jurisdictional silos, severely hampering their ability to cross-reference the physical description of the deceased with active reports outside of their immediate Midwestern geographic radius. Investigators aggressively canvassed local motels, transit hubs, truck stops, and roadside diners situated along the major interstate arteries intersecting Ohio, operating under the highly plausible theory that she was an unfortunate hitchhiker who had crossed paths with a predatory motorist. However, these exhaustive, boot-level inquiries yielded entirely negative results, confirming the terrifying reality that the young woman was completely untethered from the local community and possessed no established social footprint within the state of Ohio. The sheer absence of any localized missing persons reports matching her distinct physical profile, particularly her braided reddish, brown hair and the highly memorable buckskin jacket, forced detectives to confront the probability that she had been transported across state lines either immediately prior to or following her murder. This realization effectively neutralized standard investigative protocols, as detectives possessed no geographical starting point, no known associates to interview, and no historical context regarding the victim's life leading up to the brutal assault. The absolute lack of identification transformed her from a living, breathing individual into a sterile, institutional John Doe classification, condemning her to exist solely within the confines of police evidence lockers and classified autopsy reports, while her killer remained completely undetected. As weeks bled into months and eventually years, the complete exhaustion of traditional investigative avenues firmly established a profound, seemingly insurmountable barrier between the victim and her true identity, setting the stage for a decades-long reliance on speculative theories and agonizing forensic stagnation. As the case officially transitioned into a cold, heavily dormant status, the young woman became universally known throughout the law enforcement community and the regional press simply as the Buckskin Girl, a nameless moniker that underscored the tragic erasure of her actual human history. For over 35 years, the Miami County Sheriff's Office steadfastly refused to officially close the administrative file, periodically reopening the investigation to apply newly developed, highly sophisticated forensic technologies to the preserved biological and physical evidence collected from the 1981 crime scene. In a desperate bid to trace her geographic origins, investigators authorized advanced palynology testing on the distinct buckskin jacket and her underlying clothing, meticulously analyzing microscopic pollen grains that had deeply embedded themselves into the fabric fibers during her travels. The results of this highly specialized botanical analysis were scientifically profound, revealing specific, localized pollen signatures from vegetation indigenous exclusively to the arid, southwestern regions of the United States and the northern territories of Mexico, proving undeniably that she had spent significant time in those distinct areas shortly before her death. To further refine this complex geographical timeline, forensic anthropologists subjected her preserved hair follicles and dental enamel to rigorous isotopic analysis, scientifically measuring the specific ratios of oxygen and strontium isotopes to map her dietary intake and corresponding regional water consumption throughout different stages of her life. These isotopic signatures largely corroborated the botanical evidence, suggesting a complex migratory pattern characterized by significant time spent in the southern United States. Yet these highly technical, objective scientific facts failed to generate a specific, actionable name or a verified missing persons report. The investigation was also periodically overwhelmed by terrifying, yet ultimately false, confessions from convicted, highly publicized serial killers who actively operated across the Midwest during the early 1980s, forcing detectives to waste precious resources meticulously disproving their calculated, manipulative claims. In the early 2000s, forensic artists generated updated, highly accurate three-dimensional composite facial reconstructions utilizing the detailed measurements of her skull, distributing these haunting images across the nascent internet, and modernized national missing persons databases in a desperate plea for public recognition. Despite the massive, continuous expenditure of investigative resources, the relentless application of cutting-edge forensic botany, and the widespread national distribution of her reconstructed likeness, the true identity of the buckskin girl remains stubbornly concealed behind an impenetrable wall of historical silence. The agonizing rising action of this investigation highlighted the profound, structural limitations of objective forensic science. While researchers could precisely map her geographical movements, dictate her diet, and detail her brutal injuries, they remained entirely powerless to restore the simple, fundamental dignity of her legal name. The seemingly impenetrable deadlock that had defined the investigation for 37 excruciating years was finally shattered in the spring of 2018, precipitated directly by the visionary, unprecedented application of advanced investigative genetic genealogy. The Miami County Sheriff's Office forged a critical, strategic partnership with the DNA Doe Project, transferring the immense analytical burden from traditional law enforcement databases to the highly complex, mathematically driven realm of commercial open-source genomic mapping. The absolute foundation of this monumental breakthrough rested upon a highly fortuitous, visionary decision made by the original county coroner back in 1981, who had deliberately extracted and meticulously preserved a vial of the victim's raw blood in refrigerated storage, anticipating future scientific advancements that he could not yet fully comprehend. Modern forensic scientists carefully extracted a highly dense, comprehensive autosomal DNA profile directly from this remarkably preserved historical blood sample, immediately uploading the complex genetic markers into vast public genealogical repositories like GEDmatch to search for viable familial connections. The initial digital query instantaneously generated several distinct, distant genetic matches, providing the dedicated team of volunteer forensic genealogists with the raw, biological data necessary to begin constructing sprawling multi-generational family trees. Operating with meticulous precision, these researchers navigated through highly complex, undocumented webs of marriages, localized births, and regional migrations, tracing the intersecting bloodlines backward in time to locate common ancestral convergence points. By rigorously isolating specific paternal and maternal lineages, the genealogists systematically narrowed the vast pool of mathematical possibilities, eventually pinpointing a single, specific family structure deeply rooted in the state of Arkansas that definitively aligned with the victim's unique genetic markers. Law enforcement officials rapidly mobilized, dispatching detectives to discreetly contact the surviving members of this highly specific family tree, initiating the sensitive, emotionally fraught process of acquiring voluntary, confirmatory DNA swabs for direct, legally binding comparative analysis. When the final laboratory results were returned, the statistical probability was absolute and irrefutable, confirming unequivocally that the complex biological sequence extracted from the 1981 blood vial was a direct, undeniable match to the submitted familial reference samples. The complex, highly theoretical science of genetic triangulation had successfully accomplished what decades of traditional police work could not, completely dissolving the enduring myth of the buckskin girl and finally restoring the legal identity that had been violently stolen on that rural Ohio roadside. In April 2018, exactly 37 years after a battered body was discovered in the drainage ditch, law enforcement officially convened to announce the definitive identification of the victim as 21-year-old Marcia King, originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. The subsequent investigation into her background revealed a deeply tragic, devastating explanation for her prolonged anonymity. Her immediate family had never officially filed a formal missing persons report with any law enforcement jurisdiction. Marcia had been a highly independent, restless individual who had previously left home on multiple occasions to travel, leading her mother to operate under the agonizing, ultimately fatal assumption that her daughter, was simply living an alternative lifestyle and would eventually initiate contact on her own terms. Demonstrating an unfathomable depth of maternal hope, Marcia's mother had deliberately maintained the exact same home telephone number and resided in the same physical house for nearly 4 decades, desperately keeping the lines of communication open for a daughter who had been resting in a localized Ohio grave since 1981. While the groundbreaking application of forensic genealogy successfully provided profound, albeit devastating, closure for the King family and formally returned Marcia to her rightful place in history, the underlying criminal investigation into her brutal homicide remains fully active and aggressively pursued by cold case detectives. The formal identification has fundamentally shifted the focus of the investigation, providing law enforcement with critical, previously unknown context regarding her geographical origins and potential social networks, leading up to her journey through the Midwest. As authorities continue to actively hunt for the specific individual responsible for Marcia's violent death, the historical narrative inevitably shifts toward another deeply tragic case, defined by a family's mistaken belief in their loved one's safety. This specific intersection of prolonged anonymity and catastrophic violence directs our forensic attention eastward to a desolate riverbank in Pennsylvania, where the horrifying discovery of discarded suitcases concealed not one, but 2 stolen identities, waiting decades for the science of genealogy to expose a calculated, domestic slaughter. The stark, freezing environment of Carbon County, Pennsylvania in December 1976 offered a desolate, isolated backdrop for one of the most gruesome and heartbreaking discoveries in the annals of state law enforcement. Beneath the towering concrete spans of the Interstate 80 bridge, where the frigid waters of the Lehigh River carved relentlessly through the rural, heavily wooded landscape of Whitehaven, a local teenager exploring the desolate riverbank stumbled upon a scene of incomprehensible, calculated violence. Scattered among the winter debris and icy river rocks lay 3 heavily damaged, commercially manufactured suitcases, 2 of which had forcefully burst open upon violent impact after seemingly being hurled from the high-speed, elevated overpass above. Within these ordinary, everyday pieces of luggage, investigators from the Pennsylvania State Police found the systematically dismembered remains of an unidentified young woman, her life violently and prematurely extinguished in her late teens or early 20s. The sheer, unfathomable horror of the discovery was instantly magnified by the clinical, devastating realization that the victim was in the final, delicate stages of a full-term pregnancy, carrying a female fetus that had also tragically perished in the brutal, orchestrated slaughter. Medical examiners painstakingly reconstructed the severed remains to ascertain the precise cause of death, determining through rigorous post-mortem analysis that the young mother-to-be had been forcefully strangled, subsequently shot in the neck with a firearm, and finally subjected to post-mortem dismemberment utilizing a specifically serrated blade. To further obscure her identity and deliberately complicate any future identification efforts by forensic experts, the perpetrator had violently severed her nose, ears, and breasts, an extreme manifestation of physical overkill designed specifically to completely strip the victim of her humanity and recognizable facial features. Despite the catastrophic damage inflicted upon her physical body, forensic pathologists carefully noted that she had been generally well cared for prior to the fatal assault, exhibiting clear signs of adequate nutrition and baseline dental health that jarringly contradicted the savage, primitive nature of her disposal. The heavily laden suitcases themselves, which had been deliberately coated with black spray paint in a crude, hurried attempt to mask their original plaid patterns, were meticulously processed by evidence technicians who found them lined with specific brands of newspapers and agricultural straw, hoping these mundane packing materials might yield a tangible geographic clue. This horrifying, frozen tableau on the banks of the Lehigh River fundamentally altered the trajectory of the local police department, immediately initiating a massive, multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation that sought not only to find a ruthless, calculating killer, but to rightfully return a stolen name to a deeply wronged mother and her unborn child. The definitive inciting incident that aggressively propelled this specific case into an enduring, highly publicized forensic nightmare was not merely the sheer brutality of the mechanical dismemberment, but the agonizing realization by lead investigators that the killer had intimately known the victim, and specifically targeted both her and her unborn child. Law enforcement professionals instantly recognized that the extreme, highly personalized violence required to systematically dissect a fully pregnant teenager indicated a deeply emotional, tightly contained domestic motive rather than a random, spontaneous encounter with an opportunistic roadside predator. Operating under the highly logical, deeply entrenched assumption that a pregnant teenager vanishing just days before her anticipated delivery date would naturally trigger immediate, frantic alarms within her local community, detectives confidently dispatch comprehensive physical descriptions to every neighboring police department and regional hospital network. They systematically scoured thousands of obstetric records, aggressively canvassed local maternity wards, and extensively searched state-wide missing persons registries for any report of a young woman matching her specific biological profile, fully expecting a rapid, definitive identification to materialize within hours. Instead of finding a desperate, highly visible family actively searching for their violently abducted daughter, investigators were met with an absolute, chilling bureaucratic silence, revealing definitively that neither the mother nor the child existed within the formal administrative, governmental systems of the era. The complete absence of matching missing persons reports forced detectives to directly confront the terrifying reality that the victim had either been entirely isolated from her extended family, or that her sudden, permanent disappearance had been meticulously and effectively explained away by the very individual who murdered her. Forensic technicians exhaustively analyzed the physical evidence recovered from the interior of the suitcases, meticulously tracing the origins of the specific New York Sunday news fragments used to wrap the remains, definitively linking the immediate post-murder cover-up logistics to the broader New York metropolitan geographical area. Furthermore, the precise identification of chenille bedspread fragments and specific, localized types of agricultural straw packed within the luggage strongly indicated that the dismemberment had occurred in a residential or potentially rural setting long before the heavily laden suitcases were physically transported across state lines to the Pennsylvania Bridge. Despite these tantalizing physical clues and the specific, undeniable geographic trajectory pointing forcefully towards New York or New Jersey, the absolute, impenetrable void of a verified name effectively paralyzed the prosecutorial momentum, permanently shielding the perpetrator behind the victim's deeply tragic anonymity. This profound administrative invisibility seamlessly transformed the deeply personal, intimate slaughter into a seemingly unsolvable, sprawling puzzle, ensuring that the young woman and her child would remain permanently trapped in a sterile, nameless limbo while the primary suspect walked freely away from the Lehigh River. As the initial, highly energized investigative momentum inevitably waned and the horrific case formally transitioned into a protracted, heavily documented cold status, the unidentified victim became universally recognized within the Pennsylvania law enforcement community and the national media by the solemn, placeholder pseudonym Beth Doe. For more than 4 decades, successive generations of dedicated state police investigators adamantly refused to let her memory simply fade into institutional obscurity, continuously exhuming her carefully preserved case file to apply newly developed, highly sophisticated scientific methodologies to the remaining physical biological evidence. In a desperate, highly technical bid to establish her precise geographical origins, forensic anthropologists legally authorized advanced isotopic analysis on the victim's preserved dental enamel and deep bone fragments, precisely measuring specific chemical and mineral ratios to map her lifelong environmental exposures. The highly complex, statistically driven results of these initial isotopic tests indicated a potentially European birth, followed by a subsequent, undocumented migration to the United States, further confusing the established investigative narrative and massively expanding the potential search radius to an unmanageable international scale. While later, significantly more refined isotopic interpretations generated by advanced spectrometry, suggested she may have actually been born in the southern United States before migrating northward to the New York area. These highly technical geographic estimations consistently failed to generate a specific, actionable human identity. In 2007, recognizing the profound, revolutionary advancements in forensic genetic technology, investigators officially obtained judicial authorization to systematically exhume the buried remains of Beth Doe and her unborn daughter, successfully extracting a highly viable mitochondrial DNA profile to be uploaded into modern national law enforcement databases. Concurrently, specialized forensic artists generated deeply poignant, highly accurate three-dimensional facial reconstructions of the young woman, widely distributing these modernized, updated images across national television broadcasts, regional newspapers, and emerging internet platforms entirely dedicated to solving unsolved mysteries. Despite the continuous, massive expenditure of police operational resources, the meticulous application of cutting-edge chemical and biological analysis, and the widespread, coordinated public dissemination of her reconstructed likeness, every single promising lead inevitably terminated in a frustrating, insurmountable dead end. The investigation was continually plagued and severely hampered by the fundamental, agonizing paradox that someone, somewhere in the country, had to be missing a 15-year-old girl and her child, yet the traditional law enforcement mechanisms designed specifically to connect the unidentified remains with searching families remained entirely ineffective. This grueling, decades-long period of rising action served as a stark, undeniable testament to the strict limitations of objective forensic science when entirely divorced from familial context, proving undeniably that even the most advanced chemical profiling cannot spontaneously generate a legal name from a complete historical void. The seemingly impenetrable, heavily fortified fortress of anonymity that had rigidly defined the Beth Doe homicide investigation for 44 agonizing years was irrevocably shattered in 2021, driven directly by the revolutionary, mathematically complex application of investigative genetic genealogy. The Pennsylvania State Police formally and strategically partnered with specialized, highly advanced private genomic laboratories to successfully extract a dense, comprehensive autosomal DNA profile directly from the victim's historically preserved biological samples, representing a massive, unprecedented technological leap forward in the case. This highly refined, meticulously sequenced genetic data was cautiously and legally uploaded into vast, open-source commercial genealogical databases, allowing dedicated, highly trained forensic researchers to meticulously cast a wide digital net across millions of voluntary public submissions in search of distant familial connections. The intensive, mathematically rigorous, and highly complex process of reverse engineering these intersecting familial connections eventually yielded a definitive, undeniable biological breakthrough, pointing investigators directly toward a specific, verified family deeply rooted in the urban landscape of Jersey City, New Jersey. Following highly sensitive, discreet interviews with the surviving, unsuspecting relatives and the immediate acquisition of confirmatory, one-to-one DNA reference samples, the final laboratory results provided absolute, statistically irrefutable proof of the murdered victim's true identity. On March 31, 2021, law enforcement officials proudly and solemnly announced to the public that the tragically dismembered teenager found on the riverbank was 15-year-old Evelyn Colon, definitively and permanently restoring the stolen humanity to both her and her unborn daughter. However, the climactic, highly emotional resolution of Evelyn's true identity instantaneously catalyzed a massive, highly coordinated law enforcement operation, as investigators successfully utilized the newly revealed historical context to immediately identify the primary suspect in her brutal, premeditated homicide. Armed with Evelyn's verified name, cold case detectives meticulously reconstructed her final days in 1976, quickly and definitively ascertaining that the pregnant teenager had been exclusively residing with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Luis Sierra, in a Jersey City apartment immediately prior to her sudden, violent disappearance. The genealogical revelation seamlessly and aggressively transformed a heavily stagnant cold case into an active, high-priority manhunt, culminating merely weeks after her formal identification, when heavily armed task force officers successfully located and arrested the now 63-year-old Louis Sierra in his Ozone Park's New York residence. The shocking, highly publicized swiftness of the arrest, occurring precisely 4.5 decades after the severed suitcases were hurled from the Interstate 80 bridge, demonstrated the absolute, uncompromising power of modern forensic science to bridge the vast chasm of time and instantly hold a long, hidden predator legally accountable. The formal, legally binding identification of Evelyn Colon provided a profoundly devastating, deeply complicated emotional resolution for a family that had essentially spent 44 years operating under a meticulously constructed, tragically false narrative regarding her ultimate fate. During the subsequent, highly intense investigation following the arrest, detectives definitively uncovered the chilling, calculated reason behind the absolute lack of a formal missing persons report. Shortly after Evelyn's brutal murder, her family received a forged, highly deceitful letter specifically claiming she had safely delivered a healthy baby boy and was voluntarily cutting ties to start a new life. This calculated, manipulative piece of targeted correspondence successfully and tragically convinced her desperate parents that their teenage daughter was heavily estranged but physically safe, completely and permanently blinding them to the horrific, violent reality that she was actually lying dismembered in a sterile Pennsylvania morgue. Louis Sierra was promptly, legally extradited back to the primary jurisdiction of Carbon County, Pennsylvania, where he was formally arraigned and officially charged with multiple severe counts of criminal homicide for the premeditated, exceptionally brutal murders of both Evelyn and her full-term fetus. The ongoing, highly scrutinized judicial proceedings against Sierra stand as a permanent, legally binding testament to the relentless, uncompromising pursuit of justice by cold case detectives, strictly ensuring that the mere passage of 44 years offers absolutely no permanent legal sanctuary for those who commit such profound atrocities. Evelyn's recovered remains, strictly along with those of the innocent daughter she never got the opportunity to raise, were finally returned to her surviving relatives, rightfully allowing the grieving family to permanently replace the sterile, impersonal Beth Doe headstone with a dignified marker bearing her true, legally given name. Her profoundly tragic story forcefully underscores the terrifying, undeniable ease with which a highly vulnerable individual can be entirely erased from society when a calculating perpetrator successfully manipulates the perceptions and hopes of those who would naturally search for them. The objective, scientific resolution of this case undeniably proves that forensic genealogy possesses the highly unique, unparalleled capability to not only identify unknown murder victims, but to simultaneously expose the specific, calculated deceptions actively used by killers to successfully mask their crimes for decades. While Evelyn Colon was permanently silenced by someone intimately and deeply familiar to her, and deliberately hidden away from the world in luggage, other young victims found themselves completely isolated and viciously targeted by opportunistic predators, while independently navigating unfamiliar, highly transient environments. This critical, deeply sobering forensic transition from a carefully orchestrated, intimate domestic murder to a brutal, highly localized crime of opportunity directs our immediate attention southward to the sweltering highways of Texas, where a lost teenager desperately seeking directions walked directly into a fatal encounter that would forcefully strip her of her name for over 40 years. The formidable, institutional presence of the Texas Department of Corrections profoundly shaped the social and geographical landscape of Huntsville, Texas, during the autumn of 1980, creating an environment where transient populations frequently intersected with the rigid realities of the penal system. On the afternoon of October 31, the bustling atmosphere of the Halloween holiday was subtly interrupted by the arrival of a highly conspicuous, unusually young teenage girl who appeared to be independently navigating the heavy commercial traffic along Interstate 45. Witnesses working at local businesses, including a South End Gulf gas station and a nearby truck stop diner, vividly recalled interacting with the solitary traveler, consistently noting her polite demeanor juxtaposed against her obvious, underlying vulnerability in such a highly transient environment. The teenager, later estimated by forensic examiners to be anywhere between the tender ages of 14 and 18, was distinctively dressed for the sweltering Texas climate, wearing a bright yellow short-sleeved pullover shirt, brown corduroy trousers, and high-heeled sandals that seemed highly impractical for extensive hitchhiking. Around her neck, she wore a highly specific, rectangular pendant necklace containing a smoky glass stone, a personalized, intimate detail that strongly suggested she belonged to a family and possessed a cherished, individualized history before arriving in the unforgiving southern heat. During her documented interactions with local service workers, the young girl specifically and repeatedly requested precise geographical directions to the Ellis Prison Unit, a high-security agricultural facility located several miles north of the city limits, though she adamantly refused to disclose the specific identity of the inmate she was supposedly intending to visit. Despite her apparent, stated destination, she never officially arrived at the penal facility, and a deeply concerned waitress at the Hitching Post truck stop diner later reported that the teenager appeared noticeably exhausted and emotionally distressed during their brief conversation, though she politely declined any offers of significant, direct assistance. This final, documented sighting captured a profoundly tragic image of a young, isolated adolescent actively wandering through a dangerous, adult-oriented industrial landscape, completely severed from whatever safety net she previously possessed, and unknowingly walking directly toward an incomprehensibly violent fate. The stark contrast between her youthful innocence and the harsh, heavy-duty trucking environment established a deeply unsettling exposition, portraying a lost child whose desperate search for a specific destination was permanently and brutally interrupted by the dark, predatory reality lurking just beyond the brightly lit gas station canopies. Her seemingly mundane inquiries about local roads and prison units marked the absolute final moments of her known, documented life, setting the stage for a horrifying crime that would fundamentally shatter the local community and initiate one of the most agonizing, protracted identification efforts in the history of Texas law enforcement. The agonizing, suspenseful uncertainty surrounding her late-night movements on Halloween abruptly culminated in a scene of catastrophic, unimaginable horror on the early morning of November 1, 1980, strictly terminating any lingering hopes of her safe arrival at her intended destination. A passing truck driver navigating the desolate, heavily wooded access roads situated directly behind the Hitching Post truck stop stumbled upon the brutally battered, completely nude remains of the young teenager deliberately discarded in a shallow, grassy depression. Responding deputies from the Walker County Sheriff's Office were instantaneously confronted with a crime scene of staggering, localized brutality, determining through immediate visual assessment that the young girl had been subjected to a highly violent, prolonged physical and sexual assault before her untimely death. Forensic pathologists subsequently confirmed that the primary cause of death was acute manual strangulation, compounded by severe blunt force trauma to her facial and cranial regions, indicating that the unknown perpetrator had viciously and repeatedly beaten her in a frenzied, highly personalized attack. The inciting incident that immediately escalated this horrific murder from a localized tragedy into a sprawling, impenetrable procedural nightmare was the terrifying realization that the killer had meticulously and systematically stripped the victim of all personal belongings, leaving behind absolutely zero identifying documentation. Her distinctive clothing, including the bright yellow shirt and the brown corduroy trousers that had made her so easily recognizable to witnesses just hours prior, were entirely missing from the crime scene, effectively neutralizing the most immediate visual clues that investigators typically rely upon. Furthermore, the complete absence of a purse, a wallet, or any form of physical travel itinerary firmly cemented her tragic status as an institutional Jane Doe, violently severing her from her true name and forcing law enforcement to build an identification profile entirely from scratch based solely on post-mortem biological data. Investigators systematically cross-referenced her specific physical description, including her hazel eyes, her pierced ears, and a uniquely painted right toenail, against hundreds of active missing persons reports filed across the southern United States, yet they were met with an absolute, deafening bureaucratic silence. This profound lack of an immediate, corresponding missing child report suggested either a catastrophic failure in interagency communication or the devastating possibility that her family simply did not realize she had vanished into the dangerous, transient currents of the Texas highway system. The sheer, overwhelming violence of the crime, permanently coupled with the absolute void of her legal identity, plunged the Walker County investigators into an incredibly complex, desperate pursuit of a phantom killer, fundamentally anchoring the case in a deeply frustrating state of absolute anonymity. In the agonizing, protracted decades following the discovery of her body, the unidentified teenager became universally and sorrowfully known throughout the national law enforcement community as the Walker County Jane Doe, a sterile, institutional pseudonym that actively underscored the tragic, violent erasure of her true human history. Recognizing the strict jurisdictional limitations of the early 1980s, desperate investigators commissioned numerous, highly detailed forensic sketches and meticulously distributed thousands of these, haunting flyers to police departments, truck stops, and transit hubs across the entire North American continent, hoping her distinctive visage would trigger a localized memory. The investigative trajectory was characterized by a relentless, albeit deeply frustrating, pursuit of incredibly faint leads, including exhaustive interviews with every single inmate incarcerated at the Ellis Prison Unit, carefully operating under the logical assumption that the victim had traveled to Texas for a highly specific, targeted visitation. Despite this massive, heavily coordinated institutional effort, absolutely no inmate recognized the young girl's post-mortem photographs, and a meticulous, exhaustive review of visitor logs and incoming prison correspondence completely failed to generate a single, viable connection to the deceased teenager. The case was periodically and aggressively derailed by the manipulative, highly publicized false confessions of convicted serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, who adamantly claimed responsibility for her murder during his notorious, systemic fabrication of crimes, actively forcing dedicated detectives to waste thousands of hours meticulously disproving his convoluted, legally impossible timelines. In a desperate, highly technical bid to preserve her biological legacy for future scientific advancements, the local community humanly buried the unidentified teenager in a donated casket within the Oakwood Cemetery, ensuring she was treated with the profound dignity that her brutal killer had violently denied her in life. As traditional law enforcement methodologies systematically failed, and the trail of her actual killer grew impossibly cold, authorities officially authorized the legal exhumation of her remains in 1999, specifically aiming to extract a viable mitochondrial DNA profile to be continuously run against the evolving, yet still highly limited, national law enforcement databases. Although this crucial forensic extraction was ultimately successful, the strict, systemic reliance on the combined DNA index system yielded entirely negative results, brutally confirming that the young girl's immediate family had never had their own genetic material formally entered into the criminal justice system for cross-referencing purposes. For over 40 years, her grim, unsolved case file remained a persistent, haunting priority for the Walker County Sheriff's Office, heavily symbolizing the profound, systemic limitations of traditional investigative techniques when a victim falls entirely outside the formalized, documented administrative networks of modern society. The enduring, deeply painful rising action of this historical investigation definitively proved that without a localized, verified missing persons report to anchor the biological evidence, the most meticulously processed crime scene could not spontaneously generate a name for a violently forgotten child. The seemingly impenetrable, heavily fortified deadlock that had strictly defined the Walker County Jane Doe investigation for 41 agonizing years was irrevocably and miraculously shattered in the latter half of 2021, directly propelled by a revolutionary, mathematically complex partnership with specialized forensic genomic scientists. The Walker County Sheriff's Office formally and strategically engaged the services of Othram Inc., a highly advanced private laboratory explicitly dedicated to extracting viable genetic material from severely degraded, historically compromised biological evidence that traditional law enforcement facilities simply cannot process. Utilizing highly sophisticated, proprietary extraction methodologies, the specialized scientists successfully built a dense, comprehensive autosomal DNA profile directly from preserved tissue samples that had been securely maintained in law enforcement evidence lockers since the original 1999 cemetery exhumation. This newly refined, massively detailed genetic sequence was meticulously uploaded into vast, open-source commercial genealogical databases, fundamentally allowing highly trained forensic researchers to cast an incredibly wide digital net across millions of voluntary public submissions to locate distant familial connections. Operating with intense mathematical precision, the dedicated genealogical team successfully identified a complex web of distant genetic cousins, subsequently embarking on the grueling, highly intricate process of reverse engineering these familial connections to painstakingly construct a sprawling, multi-generational family tree. By rigorously isolating specific intersecting maternal and paternal lineages, the researchers systematically narrowed the vast pool of statistical possibilities, eventually pointing investigators directly toward a specific, verified family structure deeply rooted in the distant, northern municipality of Stillwater, Minnesota. Armed with this highly specific, geographically distant biological target, Texas law enforcement officials rapidly mobilized to discreetly contact the surviving relatives, delicately navigating the profoundly emotional, sensitive process of acquiring voluntary, confirmatory DNA swabs for direct, legally binding comparative analysis. When the final, definitive laboratory results were returned to the primary investigators, the statistical probability was absolute and scientifically irrefutable, confirming unequivocally that the complex biological sequence extracted from the murdered teenager was a direct, undeniable match to the submitted Minnesota family reference samples. The complex, theoretical science of genetic triangulation had successfully accomplished what 4 decades of traditional, heavily resourced police work could not, completely destroying the enduring, tragic myth of the Walker County Jane Doe and finally restoring the legal, given name that had been violently stolen on that rural Texas roadside. The climactic, highly emotional identification instantaneously shifted the entire investigative paradigms, providing the exhausted cold case detectives with a verified geographical starting point and a rich, localized familial context that had been utterly absent since the chilling morning of her discovery. In November 2021, the Walker County Sheriff's Office convened a deeply solemn, highly anticipated public press conference to officially announce the definitive, scientifically verified identification of the tragically murdered teenager as 14-year-old Sherri Ann Jarvis, formally returning her to her rightful place in history. The subsequent investigation into her complex background revealed a profoundly devastating explanation for her prolonged anonymity, fundamentally establishing that Sherri had legally been classified as a juvenile runaway by the state of Minnesota shortly after her sudden disappearance in early 1980. Her immediate family had never stopped desperately searching for her, actively hiring private investigators, and maintaining open lines of communication with local northern authorities, but they had absolutely no logical reason to suspect that her transient journey had taken her thousands of miles south to the sweltering highway systems of Texas. The deeply tragic administrative failure lay entirely in the severe lack of interconnected, nationalized databases during the early 1980s, which strictly prevented the desperate Minnesota missing child reports from ever cross-referencing with the gruesome, localized homicide files meticulously maintained by the Texas authorities. While the groundbreaking application of forensic genealogy successfully provided profound, deeply complicated closure for the Jarvis family and allowed them to finally bring Sherri's remains back home to Minnesota, the underlying criminal investigation into her brutal homicide remains fully active and aggressively pursued. Law enforcement officials explicitly recognize that the formal identification is merely the critical first step in achieving true justice, and detectives are currently utilizing her newly verified historical timeline to aggressively examine every single piece of physical evidence and witness testimony collected near the Huntsville truck stop. The active, highly prioritized hunt for the specific individual who viciously attacked the solitary teenager and subsequently stripped her of her identity continues unabated, driven by the absolute certainty that the perpetrator has successfully evaded severe legal accountability for over 4 decades. As investigators continuously strive to piece together the highly complex, dangerous circumstances that ultimately led Sherri Ann Jarvis to that desolate patch of Texas grass, the forensic focus inevitably shifts toward another deeply tragic case, defined by deliberate physical concealment and complex familial deception. This critical intersection of physical concealment and profound, enduring anonymity directs our attention strictly toward a rural Kentucky landscape, where a woman wrapped entirely in heavy, impermeable canvas was violently forced to wait over 30 years for science to finally reveal the deeply sinister truth of her sudden, unexplained disappearance. The dense, heavily wooded terrain flanking U.S. Route 25 in Scott County, Kentucky, provided a deeply secluded, natural vault for a secret that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of modern missing persons investigations. On the humid afternoon of May 17, 1968, a local oil field worker named Wilbur Riddle was systematically navigating the thick underbrush along the rural roadside, actively scavenging for discarded glass telegraph insulators, when his attention was violently drawn to an anomaly in the landscape. Concealed beneath a tangle of vegetation lay a large, imposing bundle wrapped tightly in a heavy, green canvas material, later explicitly identified by investigators as a commercially manufactured tarpaulin or a discarded carnival tent fragment. Upon closely inspecting the weathered, foul-smelling canvas, Riddle made the horrifying, deeply traumatic discovery of the decomposing remains of a young female victim, forcefully initiating a complex, multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation that would span exactly 30 years. Responding deputies and county coroners rapidly secured the isolated scene, determining through immediate visual assessment that the woman had been deceased for several weeks, exposing her body to severe environmental degradation that completely eradicated any possibility of a visual identification. The medical examiners painstakingly documented her specific physical attributes, noting a distinct gap between her 2 upper front teeth, and cataloging her clothing, which consisted solely of a reddish-brown sweater, a dark skirt, and a pair of simple sandals. However, the profound inciting incident that permanently derailed the initial investigative momentum was the chilling, absolute realization that the killer had meticulously stripped the victim of all personal belongings, leaving behind no purse, no jewelry, and absolutely zero identifying documentation. The specific nature of her disposal, wrapped securely in the heavy, industrial canvas and dumped in a highly remote area, strongly indicated a deliberate, calculated effort by the perpetrator to permanently conceal the crime and physically erase the woman from the visible world. As law enforcement systematically circulated her physical description and dental records to every neighboring police department and regional hospital, they were met with an impenetrable, bureaucratic silence, confirming that no local family had filed a matching missing persons report for a young woman of her description. This devastating lack of immediate, corresponding administrative data violently transformed the tragic discovery into an enduring, seemingly unsolvable forensic enigma, firmly establishing her as a permanent Jane Doe and condemning her to a localized, anonymous grave while her killer remained completely undetected. As the initial, highly energized investigative efforts inevitably stagnated due to the absolute lack of actionable leads, the unidentified woman became universally recognized throughout the state of Kentucky and the broader national media by the poignant, somber moniker of Tent Girl. In 1971, recognizing the strict jurisdictional limitations and the complete exhaustion of traditional law enforcement methodologies, the compassionate local community of Georgetown collectively funded a formal burial for the young woman in the Georgetown Cemetery, erecting a standardized headstone that forever etched her tragic pseudonym in granite. For decades, her heavily documented case file remained largely dormant within police archives, but the agonizing mystery surrounding her sudden, violent erasure profoundly captivated a young local resident named Todd Matthews, who happened to be the son-in-law of the man who originally discovered her body. Matthews developed an intense, lifelong obsession with definitively solving the Tent Girl case, meticulously compiling every available newspaper clipping, police report, and autopsy detail into comprehensive physical dossiers that dominated his personal life. As the technological landscape radically transformed in the late 1990s with the widespread proliferation of the internet, Matthews recognized a revolutionary, unprecedented opportunity to bypass the strict, geographically isolated boundaries of traditional law enforcement databases. He aggressively digitized the entirety of the Tent Girl investigative file, creating one of the earliest, most comprehensive online repositories dedicated specifically to an unidentified homicide victim, actively distributing her physical description and forensic details across emerging global message boards. This localized, citizen-led initiative organically evolved into the foundational architecture for the DOE network, a sprawling, international volunteer organization explicitly designed to cross-reference missing persons reports with unidentified remains using the vast, interconnected power of the early internet. In 1998, responding directly to the relentless, highly publicized pressure exerted by Matthews and the growing online true crime community, Kentucky law enforcement authorities formally authorized the legal exhumation of the Tent Girl's remains from her donated cemetery grave. Forensic pathologists successfully extracted highly viable biological material from her carefully preserved dental structures and deep bone fragments, meticulously generating a comprehensive DNA profile that was specifically intended for future comparative analysis against the families of known missing women. This agonizing, decades-long period of rising action highlighted a profound paradigm shift in cold case investigations, unequivocally demonstrating how the dedicated persistence of a single civilian utilizing nascent digital networks could successfully resurrect a completely stagnant, historically forgotten homicide inquiry, the seemingly impenetrable, heavily fortified fortress of anonymity that had rigidly defined the Tent Girl investigation for 3 consecutive decades, was finally shattered in the late winter of 1998. Propelled directly by the revolutionary digital infrastructure that Todd Matthews had painstakingly helped to construct. While obsessively scouring a specialized, newly established online database dedicated specifically to long-term missing persons, Matthews discovered a highly detailed, emotionally fraught posting submitted by a desperate family searching for their vanished sister, a young woman who had inexplicably disappeared from Lexington, Kentucky, in late 1967. The physical description provided in the digital inquiry, which explicitly noted a distinct, highly recognizable gap between the missing woman's upper front teeth, aligned perfectly and undeniably with the classified, heavily documented post-mortem findings detailed in the 1968 autopsy report. Matthews immediately initiated direct, sensitive communication with the family who posted the inquiry, uncovering a highly complex, deeply sinister domestic narrative that fundamentally explained the catastrophic, 30-year absence of a formal police report. The missing woman's husband had meticulously and aggressively convinced her extended family that she had voluntarily abandoned her young children to run away with another man, creating a calculated, manipulative web of deceit that successfully prevented her relatives from officially engaging law enforcement. Armed with this shocking, highly specific historical context, investigators formally requested that the surviving sibling voluntarily submit a biological reference sample to the specialized laboratory currently housing the DNA extracted during the recent Georgetown Cemetery exhumation. The subsequent genetic comparative analysis, subjected to the most rigorous, scientifically objective standards of the era, yielded an absolute, statistically irrefutable match, definitively proving that the heavily degraded biological sequence belonged exclusively to the missing Lexington mother. The unyielding, verifiable power of modern DNA analysis effectively bypassed the decades of manufactured lies, providing objective, indisputable clarity to a case that had been heavily obscured by human malice. This monumental, scientifically verified breakthrough instantly destroyed the tragic, enduring myth of the Tent Girl, exposing a profoundly cruel, calculated domestic deception that had successfully shielded a killer from legal scrutiny for an entire generation. The climactic revelation of her true identity not only provided the crucial, desperately needed biological validation for the grieving family, but it simultaneously and aggressively transformed the primary focus of the localized homicide investigation directly toward the very individual who had actively orchestrated her disappearance. In the spring of 1998, law enforcement officials convened a deeply solemn, highly anticipated press conference to officially and permanently announce the definitive identification of the victim as 24-year-old Barbara Ann Hackmann. Originally from the state of Ohio, the subsequent, aggressive reinvestigation into her complex, truncated life revealed the tragic, undeniable reality that she had been trapped in a severely abusive marriage with George Taylor, the very man who had callously lied to her family about her sudden, unexplained departure. However, the profound, highly emotional resolution of Barbara's identity instantaneously encountered a massive, insurmountable legal barrier, as detectives quickly ascertained that George Taylor, the absolute prime suspect in her brutal murder, had died from terminal cancer in October 1987. This grim, verifiable historical fact effectively rendered the pursuit of formal criminal prosecution completely impossible, dictating that the man who had violently wrapped his young wife in a heavy canvas tarpaulin and discarded her on a rural roadside would never face legal accountability in a court of law. In a highly symbolic, deeply moving ceremony held shortly after her definitive identification, Barbara's surviving family members added a new, permanent stone marker to her resting place in the Georgetown Cemetery, rightfully restoring her given, legal name while respectfully maintaining the historical, Tent Girl, inscription. Her profoundly tragic story forcefully underscores the terrifying, undeniable ease with which a domestic abuser can entirely erase a highly vulnerable individual from society by successfully manipulating the perceptions and hopes of those who would naturally search for them. The objective scientific resolution of this case undeniably proves that relentless, citizen-driven advocacy combined with objective forensic analysis possesses the highly unique capability to fundamentally expose the specific, calculated deceptions actively used by killers. While Barbara Ann Hackmann was violently silenced by an intimate partner and discarded in the dense underbrush of rural Kentucky, other complex forensic mysteries involve individuals who perished under highly suspicious, internationally baffling circumstances that defy conventional investigative logic. This critical, deeply sobering transition from a purely localized, domestic homicide concealed by familial lies directs our immediate, concentrated attention completely across the globe to a heavily populated South Australian beach. On the pristine, sandy shores of Somerton Park, the bizarre, medically inexplicable discovery of a sharply dressed, completely anonymous man would rapidly initiate one of the most convoluted, internationally recognized forensic investigations in modern history, waiting decades for genealogical science to finally dismantle a sprawling web of Cold War espionage theories. The idyllic, sun-drenched coastline of Adelaide, South Australia, typically served as a tranquil refuge for local residents, yet on the early morning of December 1, 1948, Somerton Beach became the stage for one of the most profoundly baffling forensic enigmas of the 20th century. Passers-by out for an early horseback ride and morning strolls noticed the motionless figure of a middle-aged man slumped heavily against the concrete seawall, his head resting peacefully against the cold stone in a posture that initially suggested deep sleep rather than death. Upon closer inspection, local police authorities discovered a remarkably well-preserved individual, estimated to be in his mid-40s, possessing a highly athletic physique characterized by exceptionally defined calf muscles and toes molded in a wedge shape, commonly associated with classical dancers or individuals who habitually wore pointed boots. The man was impeccably dressed for a sweltering summer morning on a sandy beach, adorned in a crisp white shirt, a red and blue tie, brown trousers, knitted socks, and polished dress shoes, all covered by a heavy, European-style double-breasted jacket that seemed entirely incongruous with the local climate. Medical personnel responding to the scene systematically documented the profound lack of any defensive wounds, defensive bruising, or obvious signs of a violent struggle, noting only an unlit, half-smoked cigarette resting undisturbed on the right lapel of his heavy coat, silently suggesting he had been suddenly stricken while resting. The initial, localized assumption by the responding Adelaide authorities heavily favored a tragic, sudden cardiovascular event or a deeply quiet, self-inflicted poisoning, prompting a standard procedural removal of the body to the local morgue for a routine post-mortem examination. However, as the assigned coroners commenced their meticulous anatomical evaluation, they quickly observed an alarming, highly suspicious pooling of blood within the deceased's internal organs, specifically noting massive congestion in the liver and spleen that actively defied the preliminary diagnosis of natural heart failure. Despite their rigorous pathological scrutiny, the attending medical professionals were entirely incapable of visually identifying any known toxic substance within his digestive tract, fundamentally failing to determine a definitive biological cause of death and instantly casting a dark, suspicious shadow over the otherwise pristine corpse. This jarring, deeply unsettling juxtaposition between the serene, public nature of his resting place and the profound, chemically mysterious destruction of his internal biology completely dismantled the initial theories of a routine fatality. The bizarre, undisturbed tableau on the Somerton beach sand aggressively established a deeply perplexing baseline for an investigation that would rapidly transcend local jurisdiction, transforming an anonymous casualty into an international symbol of clandestine operations and enduring historical mystery. The total absence of physical trauma, combined with the medically unexplainable internal hemorrhaging, strictly dictated that foul play could not be ruled out, officially cementing the beachside discovery as a top priority, highly suspicious death investigation. The definitive inciting incident that violently catapulted the Somerton Beach discovery from a localized medical anomaly into a sprawling, globally recognized procedural nightmare occurred during the meticulous inventory of the deceased's physical clothing and personal effects. As specialized law enforcement technicians systematically searched his pockets for standard identifying documentation, they were confronted with a chilling, highly calculated void, discovering absolutely no wallet, no monetary currency, and no identification cards that could legally tether the man to a verified existence. This profound administrative silence was immediately and dramatically compounded by the sinister revelation that every single manufacturer's label and personalized tailor's tag had been deliberately, meticulously excised from his garments with a sharp, surgical instrument, representing a massive, highly orchestrated effort to physically sever his geographic origins. The absolute totality of this intentional erasure effectively neutralized traditional law enforcement tracking methods, fundamentally forcing detectives to rely entirely on the bizarre, seemingly disconnected physical items recovered from his person, which included a comb, a pack of chewing gum, and an aluminum capsule containing an American brand of thread unavailable in Australia. Months into the stagnant investigation, a deeply thorough re-examination of the man's trousers by a dedicated pathologist yielded the most infamous, cryptic piece of physical evidence in the history of Australian law enforcement: a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of printed paper, hidden deep within a concealed fob pocket. Upon carefully unrolling the delicate, torn fragment, investigators discovered the printed Persian phrase, "Tam shud," which translates directly to "is ended," or "finished," explicitly recognized as the final concluding words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 12th century collection of poetry heavily focused on themes of mortality and regret. This deeply ominous, highly literate fragment was not merely a random piece of debris. Forensic analysis of the torn edges conclusively proved it had been forcibly ripped from a very specific, rare edition of the book, instantly transforming the physical investigation into a highly complex literary and linguistic manhunt. The calculated removal of his clothing labels, permanently coupled with the presence of an unidentifiable, fast-acting poison that had successfully evaded standard toxicological detection, strongly indicated that the man possessed a highly specialized knowledge of forensic evasion and chemical lethality. This terrifying realization completely shattered the conventional boundaries of a standard missing persons inquiry, actively compelling authorities to entertain the chilling probability that they were dealing with a highly trained intelligence operative who had been deliberately eliminated or who had executed a flawless, untraceable protocol for self-termination. the discovery of the deeply cryptic Tam Shud slip acted as the ultimate, irrevocable catalyst, plunging the Adelaide detectives into a labyrinthine pursuit of invisible enemies, coded messages, and a man who had successfully rendered himself a biological ghost. Investigators were strictly compelled to operate without a single, verified geographical anchor, navigating a case completely stripped of conventional sociological footprints. The investigation dramatically escalated into an unprecedented, multi-tiered intelligence puzzle when a local physician came forward to present authorities with the exact, exceptionally rare copy of the rubaiyat from which the Tam Shud slip had been violently torn, claiming he had found it discarded in the back seat of his unlocked vehicle parked near Somerton Beach shortly before the body was discovered. Upon subjecting this crucial literary artifact to rigorous forensic examination, detectives utilizing ultraviolet light discovered a series of heavily indented, faint pencil markings on the book's back cover, revealing a highly complex, seemingly encrypted sequence of letters that completely defied standard cryptographic decipherment by naval intelligence experts. Accompanying this impenetrable five-line code was a handwritten, unlisted telephone number that investigators rapidly traced directly to a young nurse named Jessica Thompson, who resided merely a few hundred meters from the exact location where the unidentified body had been discovered. When formally questioned by law enforcement, Thompson completely and adamantly denied any personal knowledge of the deceased man, though detectives distinctly noted her highly visible, near fainting physical reaction when confronted with a specialized plaster bust modeled directly from the victim's face, an emotional response that strongly contradicted her verbal dismissals. Adding to the immense complexity of the case, investigators located a brown suitcase securely checked into the Adelaide railway station luggage room the day before the man's death, containing highly specific, yet fundamentally untraceable items, including a stenciling brush, specialized maritime threading tools, and a coat featuring a distinct American feather, stitch, further complicating his geographical and professional profile. The tantalizing proximity of Thompson to the crime scene, deeply intertwined with the cryptographic anomalies and the highly specialized maritime equipment, fueled decades of rampant, internationally publicized speculation that the Somerton man was a covert Soviet or Western intelligence operative actively engaged in high-stakes Cold War espionage. Generations of dedicated amateur sleuths, highly trained military cryptologists, and seasoned investigative journalists obsessively analyzed the microscopic nuances of the uncracked code, theorizing it contained nuclear secrets, illicit gambling ledgers, or heavily encrypted logistical coordinates for clandestine troop movements. Thompson's enduring, lifelong silence regarding her potential involvement with the mysterious man only amplified the widespread belief that she served as a highly protected handler or a central figure in a localized, deeply entrenched spy ring operating along the South Australian coast. For over 70 years, the absolute failure of traditional investigative bodies to definitively identify the lethal toxin, decipher the penciled code, or penetrate the wall of silence surrounding Thompson firmly anchored the Somerton man within the realm of untouchable international myth. This sprawling, deeply frustrating period of rising action highlighted the severe limitations of circumstantial evidence, proving that even the most tantalizing web of cryptographic clues and geographical coincidences cannot spontaneously generate a verifiable, legal identity without objective biological anchoring. The sheer volume of highly circumstantial data merely compounded the mystery, serving to obscure the truth rather than actively illuminating the man's biological identity. The seemingly impenetrable fortress of Cold War mythology that had rigidly defined the Somerton man investigation for exactly 74 years was finally, completely dismantled in 2022, propelled by the relentless application of modern, highly sophisticated investigative genetic genealogy. Professor Derek Abbott, a dedicated researcher at the University of Adelaide, who had spent decades meticulously dissecting the empirical anomalies of the case, successfully collaborated with highly renowned American forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick to bypass the heavily degraded, formerly buried remains by utilizing a highly unconventional biological source. During the initial 1949 investigation, law enforcement had commissioned the creation of a detailed plaster death mask to permanently preserve the man's facial features. An invasive process that had inadvertently trapped numerous, microscopic hairs within the hardened plaster matrix. Armed with specialized, highly advanced extraction technologies designed explicitly for historically compromised trace evidence, the scientific team successfully retrieved viable autosomal DNA directly from these deeply embedded hair follicles, generating a dense, comprehensive genetic profile that represented a monumental triumph over decades of biological degradation. This highly refined genetic sequence was meticulously uploaded into vast, open-source commercial genealogical databases, fundamentally allowing the researchers to cast an incredibly wide digital net across millions of voluntary public submissions to locate distant familial connections on a global scale. Operating with intense, mathematically rigorous precision, the genealogical team systematically identified a complex network of distant cousins, geographically clustered not in the Soviet Union or the United States, but firmly within the Australian state of Victoria, instantly realigning the fundamental geographic trajectory of the entire investigation. By aggressively constructing sprawling, multi-generational family trees and meticulously isolating specific intersecting maternal and paternal lineages, the researchers successfully narrowed a vast pool of over 4,000 distinct individuals down to a highly specific, singular familial convergence. The climactic breakthrough arrived when the exhaustive triangulation of this genetic data pointed unequivocally to a single, specific male individual who had inexplicably vanished from the formal administrative records of Victoria in the late 1940s, precisely aligning with the estimated age and timeline of the Somerton discovery. When the final, definitive laboratory results were independently verified through highly rigorous comparative analysis, the statistical probability was absolute and scientifically irrefutable, completely dissolving the enduring, internationally recognized myth of the untouchable Cold War spy. The complex, highly theoretical science of genetic triangulation had successfully penetrated a 7-decade-old wall of carefully orchestrated anonymity, proving undeniably that the biological truth preserved within a few strands of hair was vastly more powerful than half a century of heavily publicized espionage speculation. This monumental scientific achievement permanently erased the speculative fiction surrounding the beachside grave, replacing decades of cinematic myth with cold, empirical biological reality. In July 2022, investigators and researchers convened to formally announce the definitive, scientifically verified identification of the Somerton man as Charles Carl Webb, a 43-year-old electrical engineer and highly skilled instrument maker originating strictly from Melbourne, Victoria. The subsequent, objective reconstruction of his personal history strictly utilized archival records to reveal a deeply tragic, entirely domestic narrative that entirely contradicted the decades of elaborate, internationally publicized espionage theories. This verified timeline fundamentally proved that his highly sophisticated physical concealment efforts were motivated by profound, localized personal distress rather than sprawling, geopolitical clandestine operations. Carl Webb was actively navigating a highly contentious, deeply documented marital separation, and had likely traveled to South Australia with the specific, deeply personal intent of locating his estranged wife. Authorities now strongly believe he heavily utilized his specialized professional knowledge of machinery and fatal chemistry to deliberately orchestrate an entirely untraceable suicide when his reconciliatory efforts ultimately failed. The cryptic, heavily analyzed code, found penciled within the rare poetry book, was scientifically and historically reassessed not as a complex intelligence cipher, but highly likely as an intensely personal, localized memory aid or a complex tracking mechanism for his documented affinity for horse racing bets. This profound re-evaluation permanently closed the door on the highly sensationalized, deeply entrenched theories involving stolen nuclear secrets, shadowy foreign operatives, and international assassination plots. His formal identification successfully restored his legally given name and provided profound, historical clarity to his surviving relatives, definitively proving that even the most meticulously executed, highly calculated plans for total self-erasure can eventually be unwound by the relentless, mathematically precise progression of modern genomic science. while the Somerton man actively and deliberately employed his formidable intellect to completely sever his ties to the living world and meticulously disguise his final, tragic moments in South Australia. Other unidentified victims were completely powerless to prevent their violent disposal at the hands of those they implicitly trusted. This highly critical, deeply sobering forensic transition from a meticulously orchestrated, highly intellectual self-concealment to a brutal, deeply intimate domestic betrayal directs our immediate attention completely across the globe to the murky, unforgiving waters of a Mississippi River. In the stifling humidity of 1982, the deeply tragic discovery of a female toddler discarded beneath an interstate bridge would brutally expose the fatal consequences of isolation, forcing a devastated community to wait decades for genealogy to finally return a stolen name to a child known only as Delta Dawn. The murky, slow-moving currents of the Escatawpa River in Jackson County, Mississippi, typically function as a quiet, undisturbed natural boundary. But on the chilling morning of December 5, 1982, this dark waterway became the grim repository for an unfathomable tragedy. A commercial truck driver, navigating the elevated spans of the Interstate 10 bridge, caught a fleeting glimpse of what he initially, logically presumed to be a discarded porcelain doll floating face down near the muddy shoreline, prompting him to immediately contact local authorities to investigate the strange debris. When responding deputies from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office arrived at the desolate riverbank, they waded into the freezing, brackish water only to be confronted with the horrifying, deeply traumatic reality that the object was not a manufactured toy, but the remarkably well-preserved remains of a female toddler. The child, subsequently estimated by forensic pathologists to be approximately 18 months of age, possessed distinctively bright strawberry, blonde hair and was dressed with meticulous, loving care in a pristine pink and white checkered dress, indicating she had been deeply cherished prior to her sudden, violent disposal. Medical personnel carefully documenting the pristine, unblemished condition of her tiny body found absolutely no external signs of chronic abuse, severe malnutrition, or systemic neglect, presenting a deeply unsettling juxtaposition between her obvious baseline health and the horrific nature of her watery resting place. The local Mississippi community, profoundly shattered by the discovery of an anonymous infant, discarded like common roadside refuse, spontaneously rallied to provide the unidentified child with a dignified, formal burial, collectively financing a beautiful funeral service and erecting a headstone bearing the affectionate, sorrowful pseudonym, Delta Dawn. This profound outpouring of communal grief effectively adopted the nameless toddler into the collective memory of Jackson County, ensuring that her brutal, unexplained death would never be relegated to a forgotten, dusty police archive while generations of dedicated detectives systematically rotated through the active investigation. Despite this overwhelming, highly publicized wave of local empathy and the massive dissemination of her physical description to every neighboring jurisdiction, the initial investigative phase was violently paralyzed by the absolute lack of identifying documentation or immediate familial claims. The stark, undeniable reality that an impeccably dressed, seemingly well cared for toddler could simply materialize deceased in a rural river without triggering a massive, frantic localized search aggressively established a deeply perplexing baseline for a homicide inquiry that would ultimately span nearly 4 decades. This chilling exposition highlighted a profoundly unnatural scenario where a child was violently severed from her familial roots, forcefully plunging law enforcement into a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional nightmare fueled entirely by post-mortem biological data and agonizingly fragmented eyewitness accounts. The definitive, agonizing, inciting incident that aggressively escalated this tragic discovery from an isolated drowning to a highly complex, potentially multi-victim homicide investigation materialized through the immediate, chilling results of the formal forensic autopsy. Pathologists conducting the rigorous post-mortem examination conclusively determined that the toddler was fully alive when she entered the frigid waters of the Escatawpa River, ruling the official cause of death as drowning strictly secondary to a deliberate, homicidal act of being forcefully thrown from the elevated interstate bridge. This horrifying, medically verified realization completely eradicated any lingering, desperate theories of a tragic, unsupervised accidental drowning along the shoreline, fundamentally proving that an adult individual had actively and intentionally subjected the helpless infant to a terrifying, fatal plunge into the dark currents below. Almost simultaneously, critical eyewitness testimonies began to actively emerge from the local driving public, with multiple independent motorists reporting a deeply disturbing sighting on the interstate bridge during the freezing, torrential rainstorm that occurred roughly 48 hours prior to the toddler's discovery. These witnesses uniformly described observing a highly distressed, disoriented adult woman, clad in a distinctively patterned blue plaid shirt and walking perilously close to the highway traffic, actively carrying a small, blanket-wrapped bundle that perfectly matched the physical dimensions of the deceased child. The terrifying logical conclusion drawn by the Jackson County investigators was that the distressed woman was almost certainly the child's biological mother, forcefully indicating that the river had likely claimed two distinct victims on that fateful, freezing night, even though only the infant's body had successfully surfaced. Operating under this highly plausible, deeply tragic double homicide theory, specialized law enforcement dive teams and marine units systematically scoured miles of the murky, debris-filled Escatawpa River for weeks, desperately dragging the riverbed in search of the missing woman's remains. But these exhaustive, heavily resourced aquatic searches yielded absolutely negative results. When detectives aggressively cross-referenced the physical descriptions of both the distressed woman and the deceased toddler against every active missing persons registry across the southern United States, they were met with an impenetrable, deafening bureaucratic silence, confirming the terrifying reality that neither individual had been formally reported missing by any concerned relatives. This profound administrative void violently transformed a localized riverbank discovery into an enduring, seemingly unsolvable forensic enigma, permanently shielding the perpetrator behind the victim's impenetrable anonymity while establishing a chilling narrative of a mother and child completely erased from the visible world. The absolute failure of traditional investigative tracking methods dictated that the case of Delta Dawn would remain severely stagnant, heavily reliant on the extraordinarily slim possibility that a distant family member might eventually realize their loved ones had never reached their intended, unknown destination. In the agonizing, protracted decades following the exhausting, ultimately fruitless river searches, the unidentified toddler became universally and sorrowfully recognized throughout the national law enforcement community as a poignant symbol of delayed justice. Her haunting, reconstructed likeness continuously distributed across evolving media platforms. Recognizing the strict jurisdictional limitations of the early 1980s, desperate investigators commissioned numerous, highly detailed forensic sketches of both the child and the distressed woman seen on the bridge, meticulously distributing thousands of these visual aids to transit hubs, roadside diners, and police departments across the entire North American continent. The investigative trajectory was characterized by a relentless, albeit deeply frustrating, pursuit of incredibly faint, highly fragmented leads, with detectives meticulously cataloging and investigating every single reported sighting of a missing toddler that remotely matched Delta Dawn's specific physical profile, only to be repeatedly devastated by subsequent biological or dental exclusions. As the technological landscape radically transformed, and traditional law enforcement methodologies systematically failed to penetrate the wall of anonymity, authorities officially authorized the legal, highly sensitive exhumation of the child's remains from her donated Jackson County grave in the late 2000s. This critical, legally sanctioned procedure was specifically intended to extract a viable mitochondrial and nuclear DNA profile from her heavily degraded skeletal structure, aiming to continuously run the newly sequenced genetic markers against the evolving, heavily expanding national law enforcement databases, specifically CODIS. Although the complex, highly specialized forensic extraction was ultimately successful in generating a workable profile, the strict, systemic reliance on criminal justice databases yielded entirely negative results, brutally confirming that the young girl's immediate family had never had their own genetic material formally entered into the system for cross-referencing purposes. The investigation was periodically and aggressively derailed by highly speculative, ultimately baseless theories proposed by amateur sleuths and internet forums, who endlessly attempted to link the child to notorious, high-profile kidnappings of the era, actively forcing dedicated detectives to waste thousands of hours meticulously disproving legally impossible geographical timelines. For nearly 40 years, the heavily documented case file remained a persistent, haunting priority for the local sheriff's office, symbolizing the profound, systemic limitations of traditional investigative techniques when a victim falls entirely outside the formalized, documented administrative networks of modern society. The enduring, deeply painful rising action of this historical investigation definitively proved that without a localized, verified missing persons report to anchor the biological evidence, the most meticulously processed crime scene could not spontaneously generate a legal name for a violently discarded infant. Investigators remained heavily burdened by the psychological weight of the unsolved crime, knowing with absolute certainty that someone, somewhere, was missing a vibrant, strawberry blonde child, yet they were completely powerless to bridge the massive chasm separating the forensic evidence from her biological origins. The seemingly impenetrable, heavily fortified deadlock that had strictly defined the Delta Dawn investigation for 38 agonizing years was irrevocably and miraculously shattered in 2020, propelled entirely by a revolutionary, mathematically complex partnership with specialized forensic genomic scientists. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office formally and strategically engaged the specialized services of Othrem Inc., an advanced private laboratory explicitly dedicated to extracting viable genetic material from severely degraded, historically compromised biological evidence that traditional, state-funded law enforcement facilities simply lack the technological capability to process. Utilizing highly sophisticated, proprietary sequencing methodologies, the specialized scientists successfully built a massively dense, comprehensive autosomal DNA profile directly from the preserved tissue samples that have been securely maintained since the authorized exhumation, representing an unprecedented technological leap forward in the stagnant cold case. This newly refined, highly detailed genetic sequence was meticulously uploaded into vast, open-source commercial genealogical databases, fundamentally allowing highly trained forensic researchers to cast an incredibly wide digital net across millions of voluntary public submissions to locate distant familial connections. Operating with intense mathematical precision, the dedicated genealogical team successfully identified a highly complex web of distant genetic cousins, subsequently embarking on the grueling, highly intricate process of reverse engineering these familial connections to painstakingly construct a sprawling, multi-generational family tree encompassing hundreds of individuals. By rigorously isolating specific intersecting maternal and paternal lineages, the researchers systematically narrowed the vast pool of statistical possibilities, eventually pointing investigators directly toward a specific, verified family structure deeply rooted in the distant municipality of Joplin, Missouri, a geographic location far removed from the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. Armed with this highly specific, verifiable biological target, law enforcement officials rapidly mobilized to discreetly contact the surviving relatives in Missouri, delicately navigating the profoundly emotional, sensitive process of acquiring voluntary confirmatory DNA swabs for direct, legally binding comparative analysis. During these intense, heavily documented interviews, the family shockingly revealed that a young woman named Gwendolyn Clemens and her 18-month-old infant daughter had inexplicably vanished from their lives in late 1982, precisely aligning with the grim timeline of the bridge discovery. When the final, definitive laboratory results were returned to the primary investigators, the statistical probability was absolute and scientifically irrefutable, confirming unequivocally that the complex biological sequence extracted from the murdered toddler was a direct, undeniable match to the submitted Missouri family reference samples. The complex, theoretical science of genetic triangulation had successfully accomplished what 4 decades of traditional, heavily resourced police work could not. completely destroying the enduring, tragic myth of Delta Dawn and finally isolating the highly specific domestic narrative that precipitated her horrific murder. In December 2020, exactly 38 years after her battered body was violently discarded into the freezing currents of the Escatawpa River, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office convened a deeply solemn, highly anticipated public press conference to officially announce the definitive identification of the toddler as 18-month-old Alisha Heinrich. The subsequent, aggressive reinvestigation into her highly complex family background revealed a profoundly devastating explanation for her prolonged anonymity, fundamentally establishing that Gwendolyn Clemens had deliberately left Missouri with Alisha and an unnamed adult male companion, informing her extended family that they were permanently relocating to Florida to entirely restart their lives. Because the family operated under the tragic, ultimately fatal assumption that Gwendolyn was simply living an estranged, highly transient lifestyle across the southern states, a formal missing persons report was never actively filed with any law enforcement jurisdiction, perfectly explaining why traditional national databases entirely failed to flag their sudden disappearance. While the groundbreaking application of forensic genealogy successfully provided profound, deeply complicated closure for the Heinrich family and finally allowed them to reclaim the stolen identity of their violently murdered relative, the underlying criminal investigation has massively expanded to address the terrifying, unconfirmed fate of Alisha's mother. Gwendolyn Clemens officially remains a missing person, heavily suspected by modern cold case detectives to be a tragic victim of foul play who likely perished in the immediate vicinity of the interstate bridge, potentially at the hands of the very individual who callously threw her infant daughter into the dark water below. The ongoing, highly prioritized law enforcement hunt for the specific individual accompanying them on that fatal journey continues unabated, driven by the absolute certainty that the perpetrator successfully manipulated the family's geographical expectations to completely mask a brutal, multi-state double homicide for nearly 4 decades. As investigators continuously strive to piece together the highly dangerous, tragic circumstances that ultimately led Alisha and Gwendolyn to that desolate Mississippi overpass, the forensic focus inevitably shifts toward another deeply horrifying case defined by absolute anonymity and the terrifying specter of serial violence. This critical, deeply sobering transition from a highly localized, domestic river tragedy to a brutally violent, roadside crime of opportunity directs our immediate attention strictly toward the harsh concrete culverts of Texas. In a desolate patch of Georgetown, a young woman stripped of everything except a highly distinctive pair of brightly colored socks was violently forced to wait over 40 years for science to definitively sever her from a notorious serial killer's web of manipulative lies. The rugged, sun-baked landscape of Williamson County, Texas, bisected by the relentless high-speed flow of Interstate 35, provided a stark, unforgiving environment for the disposal of a brutalized victim on the morning of October 3, 1979. A highway worker performing routine maintenance along the desolate frontage road on the immediate outskirts of Georgetown made a chilling, deeply traumatic discovery when he glanced down into a massive, concrete drainage culvert designed explicitly to channel torrential floodwaters beneath the heavy asphalt. Lying face down within the sterile, heavily engineered concrete structure were the decomposing remains of a young woman, violently discarded and left entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the Texas autumn. Law enforcement officers from the Williamson County Sheriff's Office rapidly descended upon the isolated, brutal scene, immediately noting the catastrophic, highly personalized violence that had abruptly and forcefully ended her life. Investigators meticulously observed severe, localized bruising around her neck that definitively indicated acute manual strangulation as the primary, medically verified cause of death, suggesting a deeply intimate, overpowering assault. The sheer brutality of the physical attack was further compounded by the stark, terrifying realization that the unknown perpetrator had meticulously stripped the young woman of all clothing and personal effects, leaving her completely nude. The only exception to this calculated erasure was a highly distinctive, brightly colored pair of orange socks that the killer had inexplicably left on her feet, a jarring detail that instantly commanded the attention of the crime scene technicians. This solitary, vibrant article of clothing sharply contrasted with the grim, clinical reality of the blood-stained concrete culvert, instantaneously becoming her defining physical characteristic and transforming her into a tragic, highly recognizable symbol of the region's unsolved roadside homicides. Medical examiners meticulously documenting the catastrophic trauma estimated her age to be anywhere between 15 and 30 years old, specifically noting that her hands displayed absolutely no defensive wounds, which strongly suggested she was either heavily incapacitated or entirely overwhelmed by her attacker long before the fatal strangulation occurred. The young woman was also formally found to be suffering from extensive, completely untreated dental issues and an advanced pelvic infection at the exact time of her death, subtle biological clues that pointed forcefully toward a highly transient, deeply impoverished lifestyle devoid of consistent medical care or a stable, localized support system. Despite these poignant, highly documented indicators of a difficult, marginalized existence, the extreme, calculated nature of her roadside disposal firmly established a deeply unsettling narrative of a vulnerable individual who had forcefully crossed paths with a merciless, opportunistic predator actively operating along the interstate corridor. This horrifying, desolate tableau within the Georgetown culvert fundamentally established a deeply perplexing, highly compromised baseline for a homicide inquiry that would ultimately endure for 4 grueling decades, heavily burdened from the very first hour by the complete absence of a legal name and the terrifying specter of transient serial violence. The definitive inciting incident that aggressively plunged this localized discovery into a sprawling, seemingly insurmountable forensic nightmare was the immediate, chilling realization that the killer had successfully orchestrated a total, absolute erasure of the victim's identity. Despite the rapid, heavily coordinated deployment of specialized crime scene technicians and the comprehensive, grid-by-grid processing of the surrounding highway infrastructure, detectives completely failed to locate a purse, discarded garments, travel documents, or any physical items whatsoever that could legally anchor the deceased woman to a verified existence. Investigators aggressively circulated highly detailed physical descriptions, heavily emphasizing her distinct oval-shaped face, reddish, brown hair, and the deeply memorable orange socks, to every single neighboring police department and regional hospital network spanning the southern United States, fully expecting a rapid, definitive identification. Instead of successfully locating a desperate, highly visible family actively searching for a violently abducted daughter, the dedicated investigators were met with an absolute, impenetrable bureaucratic silence, revealing definitively that the young woman simply did not exist within the formal administrative, governmental systems of the era. The complete absence of a matching, localized missing persons report forced detectives to directly confront the terrifying reality that the victim had either been entirely isolated from her extended family, or that her sudden, permanent disappearance had been tragically misinterpreted as a voluntary relocation by those who previously knew her. This profound administrative invisibility seamlessly transformed the deeply personal, brutal slaughter into a seemingly unsolvable, sprawling puzzle, strictly ensuring that the young woman would be universally recognized only by the sterile, institutional pseudonym, Orange Socks, while her actual, legally given name remained permanently trapped in the void. Furthermore, the strategic, highly calculated disposal of her remains directly along a major interstate artery strongly indicated that the perpetrator was highly transient, potentially utilizing the expansive highway network to rapidly cross jurisdictional lines and continuously evade traditional law enforcement tracking methods. The stark realization that the killer had actively exploited the highly transient nature of the interstate system left detectives grappling with an impossibly vast geographic suspect pool, severely hindering any localized, targeted investigative focus. The absolute failure of conventional cross-referencing to generate a single, actionable lead completely paralyzed the initial prosecutorial momentum, permanently shielding the unknown killer behind the victim's deeply tragic, enforced anonymity. This grueling, immediate, and definitively proved that without a localized, verified missing persons report to anchor the physical evidence, the most meticulously processed crime scene could not spontaneously generate a legal identity for a violently forgotten transient. In the agonizing, protracted decades following the horrific discovery in the concrete culvert, the investigation into the Orange Socks murder was violently derailed and massively complicated by the manipulative, highly publicized intervention of a notorious, self-proclaimed serial killer. In 1982, Henry Lee Lucas, an individual already incarcerated and actively confessing to hundreds of unsolved homicides across the United States in a calculated, highly deceptive bid for improved prison conditions, explicitly claimed responsibility for the Georgetown murder, providing investigators with a highly detailed, albeit entirely fabricated, narrative of the crime. Lucas formally and publicly stated that he had picked a young woman up as a hitchhiker in Oklahoma, engaged in a consensual sexual encounter with her, and subsequently murdered her during a violent physical altercation before discarding her body in the Williamson County culvert. Despite the severe, undeniable lack of corroborating physical evidence tying Lucas to the specific crime scene, his confession was legally accepted by the desperate, exhausted local authorities, directly leading to a formal conviction and a highly controversial death sentence in 1984, which effectively, yet entirely falsely, closed the active investigative file. However, rigorous, subsequent investigations conducted by dedicated journalists and specialized legal task forces meticulously unraveled Lucas's sprawling web of lies, definitively proving through immutable employment records and verified, documented timelines that he was actually working in Jacksonville, Florida, on the exact day the young woman was murdered in Texas. This shocking, highly publicized revelation of severe prosecutorial error fundamentally destroyed the state's entire case against Lucas, leading directly to the formal commutation of his death sentence by the Texas governor, and forcefully ripping the heavily compromised cold case violently back open. The devastating realization that the actual, highly dangerous killer had completely evaded justice while law enforcement focused entirely on a fabricated, manipulative confession plunged the Williamson County Sheriff's Office back into a state of profound, highly frustrating stagnation. It was a catastrophic, highly systemic distraction that allowed the true perpetrator of the brutal crime to slip entirely into the shadows, completely unburdened by the relentless pressure of an active, highly prioritized police manhunt. Desperate cold case detectives continuously utilized evolving forensic technologies over the ensuing years, repeatedly submitting the victim's heavily preserved biological samples to the combined DNA index system and widely distributing updated, three-dimensional facial reconstructions across the modern internet. But these noble efforts yielded absolutely nothing but agonizing, repeated dead ends. For nearly 40 years, the heavily documented case file remained a highly toxic, persistent symbol of systemic law enforcement failure, proving undeniably that the aggressive pursuit of a sensationalized confession had actively permitted a brutal, opportunistic predator to maintain absolute, terrifying anonymity. The seemingly impenetrable, heavily fortified fortress of anonymity and institutional failure that had rigidly defined the Orange Socks investigation for precisely 4 decades was irrevocably shattered in 2019, driven directly by the revolutionary, mathematically complex application of investigative genetic genealogy. The Williamson County Sheriff's Office formally and strategically partnered with the DNA Doe Project, effectively transferring the immense analytical burden from entirely exhausted traditional law enforcement databases to the highly complex, mathematically driven realm of commercial, open-source genomic mapping. Utilizing highly sophisticated, proprietary extraction methodologies, specialized scientists successfully built a massively dense, comprehensive autosomal DNA profile directly from a deeply preserved, historical blood sample that had been meticulously stored in the county evidence locker since the initial 1979 autopsy. This newly refined, highly detailed genetic sequence was cautiously and legally uploaded into vast, interconnected public genealogical repositories, fundamentally allowing highly trained forensic researchers to meticulously cast an incredibly wide digital net across millions of voluntary public submissions in search of distant familial connections. Operating with intense, mathematically rigorous precision, the dedicated volunteer team successfully identified a complex web of distant genetic cousins, subsequently embarking on the grueling, highly intricate process of reverse engineering these familial connections to painstakingly construct a sprawling, multi-generational family tree. By rigorously isolating specific intersecting maternal and paternal lineages, the genealogists systematically narrowed the vast pool of statistical possibilities, eventually pointing investigators directly toward a specific, verified family structure deeply rooted in the distant, northern Texas city of Abilene. Armed with this highly specific, scientifically verified biological target, law enforcement officials rapidly mobilized to discreetly contact the surviving relatives, presenting them with a newly revised, highly accurate forensic sketch that had been fundamentally informed by the victim's specific, extracted genetic phenotypes. The profound, undeniable power of objective biological evidence had successfully bypassed decades of administrative errors, completely establishing the foundational truth of the victim's existence and tearing down the false narratives that had plagued the case. The climactic, highly emotional breakthrough arrived instantaneously when a surviving sister definitively and tearfully recognized the reconstructed image as her deeply missed sibling, immediately leading to the acquisition of voluntary, confirmatory DNA swabs for direct, legally binding comparative analysis. When the final laboratory results were mathematically verified, the statistical probability was absolute and scientifically irrefutable, completely dissolving the tragic, enduring myth of the orange socks Jane Doe and finally isolating the highly specific domestic narrative that tragically preceded her horrific murder. In August 2019, exactly 40 years after her violently brutalized body was initially discovered discarded in the highway culvert, the Williamson County Sheriff's Office convened a deeply solemn, highly anticipated public press conference to officially announce the definitive identification of the victim as 23-year-old Debra Jackson. The subsequent, aggressive reinvestigation into her highly complex family background revealed a profoundly devastating explanation for her prolonged anonymity, fundamentally establishing that Debra had voluntarily left her family home in Abilene in 1977 to aggressively pursue a highly transient, independent lifestyle. Because her immediate family operated under the tragic, ultimately fatal assumption that she was simply living entirely off the grid and would eventually initiate contact on her own terms, a formal missing persons report was never actively pursued or filed with any local law enforcement jurisdiction. The profound, heartbreaking reality was that her relatives had spent 40 years hoping she was simply navigating a different path, completely unaware of the extreme, horrifying violence she had suffered alone on a desolate stretch of Texas highway. While the groundbreaking application of forensic genealogy successfully provided profound, deeply complicated closure for the Jackson family and permanently replaced the sterile orange socks moniker with her legally given name, the underlying criminal investigation into her brutal homicide remains fully active and heavily scrutinized by modern cold case units. The formal identification has fundamentally shifted the focus of the cold case, providing law enforcement with previously unknown, critical context regarding her final, documented movements prior to her arrival in Williamson County, effectively giving detectives a verifiable geographical starting point. Detectives are currently utilizing her newly verified historical timeline to aggressively re-examine every single piece of physical evidence, actively hunting for the highly dangerous, unverified predator who actually strangled Debra and successfully utilized a serial killer's false confession as the ultimate, decades-long alibi. As investigators continuously strive to piece together the highly dangerous, transient circumstances that ultimately led Debra Jackson to that desolate Texas drainage pipe, the forensic focus inevitably shifts toward another deeply horrifying case defined strictly by the terrifying reality of a documented, highly mobile serial predator. This critical, deeply sobering forensic transition from an opportunistic roadside murder, entirely obscured by false confessions, directs our immediate attention completely toward a rolling chamber of horrors cleverly disguised as a commercial 18-wheeler. In an abandoned Illinois barn, the horrific, meticulously documented discovery of a young woman's decomposed remains would brutally expose the fatal, terrifying consequences of crossing paths with Robert Ben Rhodes, forcing a desperate family to wait for photographic evidence, to finally reveal the deeply sinister truth of a runaway's final moments. The American Interstate Highway System, a sprawling network of asphalt veins connecting distant cities, has long provided an essential infrastructure for commerce. But during the late 20th century, it concurrently served as a vast, unregulated hunting ground for highly mobile predators. The perceived freedom of the open road heavily masked a terrifying vulnerability for runaway youths and transient individuals who relied entirely on the perceived goodwill of passing motorists to safely navigate the vast expanses of the country. This stark, highly dangerous reality was systematically and brutally exploited by Robert Ben Rhodes, a seemingly ordinary long-haul truck driver who deliberately utilized his commercial profession as an impenetrable, rolling camouflage for his sadistic compulsions. Rhodes meticulously modified the sleeper cab of his standard 18-wheeler, retrofitting the enclosed space into a soundproof, highly functional mobile torture chamber, completely equipped with specialized restraints, surgical instruments, and reinforced locks that strictly prevented any possibility of escape. From the elevated vantage point of his driver's seat, he continuously surveyed the desolate highway shoulders and transient hubs, actively seeking out highly vulnerable targets who possessed severed social ties and would not be immediately reported missing by localized authorities. This sophisticated, deeply terrifying mobile operation allowed Rhodes to abduct, severely assault, and indefinitely hold his victims captive while continuously crossing multiple state lines, fundamentally destroying any localized law enforcement efforts to establish a coherent geographic pattern. His calculated, highly methodical approach to serial violence relied entirely on the fundamental anonymity of the interstate system, ensuring that the isolated screams of his captives were completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the heavy commercial diesel engine. By constantly remaining in motion, he successfully decoupled the scenes of his violent abductions from the eventual, highly remote disposal sites of his victims, creating a sprawling, heavily fragmented forensic puzzle that actively defied traditional jurisdictional boundaries. This terrifying exposition establishes a deeply unsettling baseline for our final, most harrowing case, focusing squarely on the profound, devastating consequences of a young, isolated individual unknowingly crossing paths with an apex predator who possessed both the physical means and the calculated psychological drive to completely erase her existence from the living world. The sheer, mechanical efficiency of Rhodes' mobile operation directly guaranteed that his victims were subjected to prolonged, unimaginable terror completely isolated from any potential rescue, forcing us to directly confront the chilling intersection of mechanical engineering and unrestrained human malice. The highly structured, terrifyingly efficient anonymity of Rhodes' operation momentarily fractured in the early spring of 1990, when the violent reality of his mobile crimes physically spilled over into the quiet, rural agricultural landscape of southern Illinois. In an isolated, heavily dilapidated abandoned barn, situated far off the heavily trafficked commercial routes, local authorities made the horrifying, deeply traumatic discovery of the severely decomposed remains of a young female victim. The severe structural decay of the barn provided a grim, shadowed resting place that had effectively shielded the victim from immediate public view for an extended period, heavily indicating that the perpetrator possessed a calculated, deeply methodical understanding of remote, localized geography. Responding crime scene technicians from the Illinois State Police meticulously processed the desolate, highly contaminated environment, recovering the heavily degraded skeletal structure alongside a few scattered, highly compromised physical artifacts that offered absolutely no immediate identifying context. Medical examiners conducting the rigorous post-mortem analysis were violently confronted with the sheer brutality of the disposal, formally noting that the extreme environmental degradation and systemic animal scavenging had permanently eradicated critical biological evidence, making the precise determination of the fatal trauma incredibly difficult. However, the absolute lack of identifying documentation, personal belongings, or a localized missing persons report matching her specific physical parameters instantly plunged the rural police department into a massive, heavily stagnant procedural nightmare. The definitive inciting incident was not merely the tragic, localized discovery of the unidentified remains, but the terrifying, undeniable realization that this rural Illinois barn had been deliberately selected as a highly secure, geographic dumping ground by a transient killer completely unmoored from the local community. Law enforcement officials aggressively cross-referenced her heavily limited physical profile against regional missing persons databases, desperately searching for a corresponding runaway or missing child report, but they were met with an impenetrable, deafening bureaucratic silence that permanently sealed her identity behind a wall of decomposition. This profound administrative void aggressively transformed the tragic discovery into a seemingly unsolvable forensic enigma, permanently establishing her as an institutional Jane Doe and dictating that her brutal killer would remain completely undetected, continuously operating his mobile chamber of horrors across the national highway network. The stark, desolate reality of the barn aggressively underscored the absolute vulnerability of the victim, forcefully initiating a highly complex, deeply frustrating investigation that completely lacked a verifiable geographic starting point or a legally established human name. The investigative trajectory remained completely stagnant, heavily anchored in biological anonymity, until a fundamentally unrelated, highly dramatic law enforcement intervention occurred thousands of miles away in the arid, sun-baked landscape of Arizona. In April 1990, an exceptionally observant state trooper conducting a routine commercial vehicle inspection on the shoulder of Interstate 10 noticed highly suspicious, deeply irregular behavior from Robert Ben Rhodes, promptly initiating a localized, tactical search of his massive 18-wheeler. This routine administrative stop violently unraveled the trucker's horrific double life, as the trooper successfully discovered a terrified, severely restrained female victim actively held captive within the highly modified, soundproofed sleeper cab, leading directly to Ryder's immediate, heavily publicized arrest. As a massive, multi-state task force aggressively descended upon Rhodes' deeply fortified Houston residence and meticulously cataloged the contents of his seized vehicle. They recovered an extensive, highly disturbing collection of personal trophies, meticulous written journals, and an immense archive of physical photographs systematically detailing his horrific crimes. Among this deeply traumatic visual evidence, seasoned investigators discovered a series of chilling, undeniable photographs that instantly and violently connected the incarcerated trucker directly back to the unsolved, localized mystery of the abandoned Illinois barn. The most devastating, historically infamous photograph depicted a young, visibly terrified female victim standing directly against the weathered, highly recognizable wooden interior of that specific agricultural structure, forcefully proving that Rhodes had utilized the location not just as a disposal site, but as a staged environment for his sadistic documentation. The young woman in the image was dressed in an oversized, black dress and a pair of matching dark heels, her head forcefully and crudely shorn of her natural hair, projecting a deeply haunting aura of absolute, inescapable despair as she looked directly into the camera lens of her executioner. Investigators meticulously analyzed the precise background details of the photograph, perfectly matching the specific wood grain, structural beams, and lighting anomalies directly to the Illinois crime scene, formally establishing an undeniable, scientifically verified visual link between the anonymous remains and the living girl captured in the frame. However, while the photograph successfully provided investigators with the exact face of the victim and definitively identified her brutal killer, it simultaneously initiated a grueling, desperately urgent manhunt for her legal identity, as Rhodes adamantly refused to disclose her true name or any specific details regarding her initial abduction. This profoundly disturbing rising action completely inverted the traditional forensic process. Investigators securely possessed the verified image of the murder, the specific location of the crime, and the actual perpetrator in custody, yet they remained completely paralyzed by their absolute inability to officially restore the stolen name of the traumatized girl, trapped forever in the photograph. The agonizing, highly publicized effort to definitively identify the young woman in the harrowing photograph heavily relied on the widespread national distribution of the image across modern media networks, hoping to finally penetrate the specific geographic isolation of her surviving family. Desperate cold case detectives continuously circulated the heavily redacted, chilling image of the girl with the shorn hair to police departments, missing child organizations, and television broadcasts, strategically utilizing the sheer, undeniable horror of the visual evidence to actively solicit critical public assistance. The climactic, highly emotional breakthrough finally materialized when the photograph successfully reached the localized jurisdiction of Pasadena, Texas, where a desperate family immediately and tearfully recognized the deeply distressed facial features as belonging to their missing teenage daughter. Through rigorous, scientifically objective comparative analysis, utilizing both highly detailed dental records and advanced biological matching, forensic pathologists unequivocally confirmed that the decomposed remains recovered from the Illinois barn belonged exclusively to 14-year-old Regina Walters. The definitive, scientifically verified identification successfully collapsed the massive, highly complex investigative timeline, rapidly allowing detectives to finally piece together the highly tragic, documented sequence of events that directly led to her brutal, untimely demise. It was aggressively established, through meticulous historical reconstruction, that Regina had fundamentally disappeared from Texas in early 1990, alongside her fiercely protective boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones, heavily suggesting that the two runaway teenagers had tragically accepted a fatal ride from the unassuming commercial truck driver. This profound revelation violently exposed the absolute, terrifying scope of Rada's operational capacity, mathematically proving that he had successfully overpowered, abducted, and maintained control over two distinct individuals simultaneously within the heavily fortified confines of his 18-wheeler. The successful biological identification of Regina not only definitively restored her violently stolen name, but it completely dismantled the perpetrator's heavily guarded silence, strictly providing the massive, multi-state prosecutorial team with the exact, legally binding narrative required to pursue absolute legal accountability. The terrifying, undeniable reality that her final, documented moments were actively orchestrated and permanently preserved by the very individual intending to extinguish her life stands as a permanent, horrific testament to the profound depravity of the interstate serial killer. Following the definitive, legally verified identification of the remains and the insurmountable weight of the highly specific photographic evidence, the localized prosecutorial momentum against Robert Ben Rhodes became completely unstoppable. In 1992, aggressively facing a meticulously constructed, multi-state legal case bolstered directly by the undeniable visual documentation of his crimes, Rhodes was formally convicted and strictly sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for the premeditated, highly calculated murder of Regina Walters. The subsequent, heavily structured judicial proceedings permanently removed the apex predator from the commercial highway network, definitively ensuring that his mobile, soundproof chamber of horrors was violently dismantled and systematically destroyed by the state. Tragically, the heavily documented investigation later confirmed that Regina's companion, Ricky Lee Jones, had also been brutally murdered by Rhodes, his own remains remaining completely unidentified for over a decade in a separate, highly remote jurisdiction before modern genetic tracing finally restored his identity. The deeply sobering reality of this case fundamentally proves that the sheer scale of the American interstate system, while effectively connecting the nation, provided an unprecedented, terrifying camouflage for individuals completely devoid of baseline human empathy. Regina's profoundly devastating story actively represents the absolute darkest intersection of youthful vulnerability and mechanized, serial violence, strictly highlighting the terrifying ease with which an isolated runaway could be entirely consumed by the transient void, while the objective, rigorous application of forensic science successfully secured legal accountability and successfully returned Regina to her grieving family. The absolute horror captured within that solitary barn photograph remains permanently seared into the historical record of modern law enforcement. The complete, factual resolution of these 10 agonizing investigations undeniably proves that while the machinery of justice may be heavily delayed by decades of silence, the biological truth inherent in the victims cannot be permanently suppressed by those who sought to erase them. This stark, overarching reality naturally forces us to step back from the highly specific, granular details of these resolved mysteries and critically examine the broader, heavily enduring impact of modern forensic science on the vast, terrifying landscape of those who are still waiting to be named. The relentless evolution of modern forensic science has proven that time can no longer permanently shield the guilty, transforming forgotten biological evidence into a delayed, yet absolute, instrument of justice. As I thank you for watching and we close these 10 agonizing chapters, we are left to ask, how many more nameless victims are still waiting out there in the dark, silently relying on the future to finally speak their names?